Hello there. Thank you for being here tonight. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe the day still hangs around a little. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're traveling to a place that might be the origin of paradise itself. Not metaphorical paradise, not theological abstraction, but an actual location. A real place where ancient Sumerians believed the world began, where death did not exist, where sickness was unknown, where the gods first created order from chaos. The texts describe it with remarkable specificity. In Dilmun, the raven utters no cry, the lion kills not, the wolf snatches not the lamb. 4,000 years ago, people wrote these words, described this place, named it, located it somewhere east, across warm waters, in a land of sweet springs and endless life. Was Dilmun real, or was it always myth? Where are you listening from tonight? I wonder if you can imagine warm Gulf waters, islands rising from shallow seas, the smell of salt and date palms. This is the question we're exploring. Whether paradise, the original paradise, the one that might have inspired later stories of Eden and eternal gardens, whether that place existed, whether archaeology can find what mythology remembers, whether the boundary between sacred text and historical fact might be thinner than we assume. Dilmun appears in Sumerian writings as early as 3000 BCE. Sometimes it's described as trading port, source of copper and dates, a place merchants sailed to, a real destination. But in other texts, the same name means something different, means the land where gods dwell, where Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, was granted immortality, where Enki created fresh water from salt, where humanity's story began before the fall, before the expulsion, before paradise was lost. The contradiction is fascinating, is troubling, is the heart of the mystery. How can one place be both ordinary trading hub and mythological paradise? How can the same name refer to merchant docks and deathless garden? Perhaps Dilmun was real place that became mythologized. Or perhaps myth came first, and later peoples gave that sacred name to actual island they discovered. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that makes archaeologists pause, perhaps both are true. Perhaps paradise was real, was an actual place that was lost, and the memory survived, transformed into myth, into sacred geography, into the stories every culture tells about the Golden Age, the time before, the place we came from, the home we can't return to. The evidence exists. Clay tablets pressed 4 millennia ago, trade records listing Dilmun's exports, religious texts describing its sacred nature, and on an island in the Persian Gulf, in modern Bahrain, ruins, temples, burial mounds, seals and pottery, the physical remains of a Bronze Age civilization, a civilization that called itself Dilmun, that traded with Sumer and the Indus Valley, that buried its dead in countless thousands of graves, that built around fresh water springs in the middle of salt seas. That just might, be the real location behind the myth. Or might be ordinary culture that borrowed a sacred name, or might be something more complex, something between memory and invention, between history and hope. If you're inclined, a like or subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps this space find others who might need it. But no pressure. You're here now. That's what matters. Now settle in. Feel whatever's around you. Let your breath slow. Picture the Persian Gulf, not as it is today, though we'll get there, but as it was 20,000 years ago, when the Ice Age gripped the north, when sea levels were lower, much lower, when what's now underwater was dry land, river valleys, coastal plains, places where people lived, built, created cultures we'll never know because the seas rose and covered everything. The Gulf was smaller then, shallower, the islands were mountains, and somewhere in that lost landscape, in that drowned world, something happened, something that people remembered, that they told stories about, that survived the floods, the migrations, the collapse of civilizations, and came down to us as myth, as sacred text, as the tantalizing possibility that paradise wasn't invented, was remembered. Take a breath. Tonight, we'll explore this, gently, without demanding answers. We'll look at the archaeological evidence, the cuneiform tablets that speak of Dilmun, the ruins in Bahrain, the burial mounds that number in the 100,000s, the seals that travelled from the Gulf to Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. We'll examine the myths, the descriptions of paradise, the fresh water rising from salt, the absence of death and pain, and we'll ask the question that archaeology and mythology must ask together. Can myth preserve memory? Can sacred stories encode historical truth? Can we find paradise if we know where to look? The answer isn't simple, isn't certain, might not exist at all, but the search reveals something about what paradise means, about why humans create it, about the relationship between the places we remember and the places we imagine, about how loss creates longing, how longing creates story, how story preserves what would otherwise be forgotten. Whether Dilmun was real or imagined, it matters still, because the question touches something deep, something about origin, about belonging, about the place we came from before everything went wrong, the place we might return to if we could only remember the way. The journey begins not in paradise but before it, in the geological deep time that set the stage, in the Ice Age world when seas were lower and coastlines were different, in the flooding that came after, that drowned the river valleys and created islands from highlands. That might have destroyed paradise, or might have created the conditions for it to emerge. Either way, the waters remember, the earth remembers, and we'll trace that memory carefully, patiently, following where it leads. Long before anyone wrote the word Dilmun, long before Sumer existed or temples rose or merchants sailed with copper and dates, the Persian Gulf was different, completely different, not just culturally, not just politically, but physically, geographically. The water was elsewhere, the islands were mountains, the coastline was kilometres, tens of kilometres, from where it rests today. This was 20,000 years ago, the last ice age. The world locked in cold, glaciers covering the northern continents, so much water frozen into ice that sea levels dropped dramatically, more than 100 meters lower than today. And the Persian Gulf, which seems timeless, which feels permanent, was mostly dry land. Imagine what that looked like. The Gulf as river valley, as coastal plain, the Tigris and Euphrates joined into single massive river, flowing through what's now underwater, cutting through exposed seabed, creating floodplains and deltas far to the south and east of their current mouths. The Arabian Peninsula and Iran were connected, not by water, but by land. You could walk from one to the other, could follow river valleys, could settle in places that are now 40 meters beneath warm salt water. The geography we think of as eternal, the islands, the coastlines, the shape of the Gulf, none of that existed yet, was waiting, was in the future. First the ice had to melt, first the water had to rise, first the transformation had to occur that would drown an entire landscape and create the world where Dilmun would emerge. The air smelled different, cooler, drier perhaps. The exposed seabed would have been clay and silt, river deposits. The vegetation was adapted to different rainfall patterns, different temperatures. We can't know exactly what it looked like, can't reconstruct every detail, but we know it wasn't desert, wasn't the arid landscape that dominates the region today. The Ice Age world was wetter in some places, the monsoon patterns different, the rivers carrying more water, supporting more life, creating ecosystems that would vanish when the climate shifted, when the Holocene began, when the warming came and changed everything. Perhaps people lived there, in that lost landscape, in the river valleys that are now Gulf floor. The evidence would be underwater if it exists, would be buried under meters of sediment, under millennia of accumulation, under the slow, patient deposition that covers everything the sea claims. We found stone tools on what are now submerged beaches, have found evidence of human presence in caves that are now below sea level. The archaeology is difficult, fragmentary, but suggestive. People were there, living in the landscape that would become the Gulf, building, we assume, making lives, creating cultures, in a world they thought was permanent, that felt eternal, that couldn't drown. They didn't know what was coming, didn't know the ice was already melting, that the seas were beginning to rise, that their world, their familiar landscape, their home, was on borrowed time. Take a breath here, let that impermanence settle. When the Ice Age ended, when the warming began around 15,000 years ago, the transformation was gradual, but relentless. Not sudden flood, not catastrophe in single generation, but slow rise, millimeter by millimeter, centimeter by centimeter, year after year, century after century, the water creeping inland, claiming lowlands first, then valleys, then coastal plains. The process took thousands of years, but from human perspective, over lifetimes, over generations, it was noticeable, dramatic even. Your grandfather's village might be inland, yours might be coastal, your grandson's might be underwater. The memory of lost places, of homes abandoned, of graves left behind as water advanced, that memory would be powerful, would be traumatic, would be the kind of thing you'd tell stories about, would preserve in whatever ways pre-literate cultures preserve such things, in oral tradition, in myth, in sacred narratives about the time before, when the world was different, when paradise existed. Before the waters came and took it away, the highlands became islands, slowly, as water rose around them, as valleys filled, as lowlands drowned. What had been continuous landscape fractured into archipelago. Bahrain, which would become identified with Dilmun, was highland before it was island, was elevated ground in river valley, the fresh water springs that would make it famous, that would make it sacred. Those already existed, were flowing, were creating oases, making the area attractive, habitable. But it wasn't island yet, wasn't separated from larger landmass. That came later, as the Gulf filled, as the rising seas reached modern levels around 6,000 years ago. Only then did the geography we recognize emerge. Only then did the islands become islands, the coastlines stabilize, the Persian Gulf take its current shape. Perhaps this is when Dilmun became possible, not as concept, that might be older, but as actual place, as island civilization, as location made special by geology and geography. The fresh water springs would be precious, essential. On small island surrounded by salt water, fresh water is life, is the difference between habitable and uninhabitable. The springs made Bahrain possible, made settlement feasible, made it attractive to people looking for land in newly configured world. The island was visible from shipping routes, was positioned perfectly for trade between Mesopotamia and points east, was neither too close nor too far from major centres. The geography was ideal, not for paradise necessarily, but for port, for trading hub, for the practical civilization that archaeology reveals. Whether that practical place inherited the name of an older paradise, or whether it became paradise through its own virtues, that's the question. That's the mystery we're beginning to circle. The stars that watched the Ice Age world transform, that witnessed the flooding of river valleys and the birth of islands. Those stars still shine, barely changed. The same patterns, the same lights, marking time with patience that makes human timescales seem insignificant, makes the rise of civilizations and the drowning of landscapes seem like brief moments, quick flickers. The stars don't care about Dilmun, don't know if paradise existed, don't preserve memories of what was lost. Just shine, just mark the turning of cosmic cycles while below, on small changing planet, water rises and falls, ice forms and melts, landscapes emerge and drown, and humans, adapting, migrating, remembering, create stories about what was and what might have been, about the places we came from, the homes we lost, the paradise that existed before everything changed, before the waters rose, before we were expelled, before the world became what it is now, which is beautiful and harsh and nothing like what it was, nothing like what memory or myth or the fading cultural recollection says it used to be. The stage was set, the geography was forming, the Gulf was filling, the islands were emerging, and in Mesopotamia, to the north and west, something else was happening. Humans were settling, farming, building the first cities, developing writing, creating the civilization that would produce the texts, the tablets that mention Dilmun, that describe it, that give us the name and the stories and the evidence we're trying to interpret. The forgotten world was becoming the remembered world. The geological transformation was giving way to cultural creation, and in that transition, In that moment when nature finished shaping the landscape and humanity began shaping meaning, Dilmun was about to enter history. When the first cities rose in southern Mesopotamia, when Uruk and Ur emerged from agricultural villages into urban centres, when writing was invented to track temple offerings and trade goods, the world was taking shape. Not just physical shape, cognitive shape, mental shape, the shape of how humans understood geography and organised space and named what they encountered. This was between 4000 and 3000 BCE, the Ubaid period transitioning to the Uruk period. Civilization in the sense we recognise it, cities, writing, specialised labour, complex social hierarchies, was crystallising. And with it came a particular way of seeing the world, a mental map, a sacred geography that organised space according to meaning as much as distance. The Sumerians were not the first people in Mesopotamia, were inheritors of earlier cultures. The Ubaid peoples who came before left pottery and temple foundations and settlement patterns that Sumerians built upon. Perhaps some of the religious concepts were inherited too. Perhaps Dilmun, as idea, as name, as sacred place, predates the Sumerians, was passed down from earlier peoples, or perhaps Dilmun emerged fresh in Sumerian religious imagination, was their innovation, their creation. We can't know. The Ubaid peoples left no writing, left no text to tell us what they believed, what they called distant lands, what their sacred geography looked like. We have only archaeology, only artifacts. Only the silent material remains that suggest but don't speak, don't clarify, don't answer questions about belief and myth and the names given to places beyond their immediate world. What we do know is that when writing appears, when the Sumerians begin pressing symbols into wet clay, Dilmun is already there, already part of the conceptual landscape, already mentioned in the earliest texts, not explained, not introduced, just assumed, as if everyone knows what Dilmun means, where it is, why it matters. The tablets from around 2500 BCE mention Dilmun in administrative contexts, trade records, lists of goods imported, copper from Dilmun, dates from Dilmun, precious woods. The economic reality is clear, undeniable. Dilmun was trading partner, was source of materials Mesopotamia needed, was real place that real merchants sailed to, conducted business with, returned from with cargo. But the religious texts, those are different. Those describe Dilmun not as port, but as paradise, as pure land, bright land, land where sun rises, land of the living. The descriptions are specific but strange. In Dilmun, the raven utters no cry. Why would ravens be mentioned? What does their silence signify? The lion kills not, the wolf snatches not the lamb. This is predators made peaceful, nature transformed, violence eliminated, death absent. This isn't description of trading port. This is description of paradise, of golden age, of time or place where natural law is suspended, where suffering doesn't exist, where the world works differently than it works anywhere we know, anywhere we've experienced, anywhere that actually exists in the world as we understand it. Perhaps you're wondering how both can be true, how the same name can mean merchant docks and deathless paradise, how practical trade records and mystical religious texts can refer to same location with such different meanings. The answer might be that they're not referring to same location, that Dilmun meant different things in different contexts, that the word had multiple meanings, like how Columbia can mean a university, a country, a river, a space shuttle, a poetic personification of America. Words contain multiple meanings, can shift depending on context. Dilmun the trading port and Dilmun the mythological paradise might be distinct, might be separate concepts that happen to share a name. Take a breath, rest with that ambiguity, with that. Or perhaps the distinction is wrong. Perhaps to Sumerians, the separation between practical and sacred didn't exist as we make it. Perhaps trading port could be paradise. Perhaps sacred place could have docks and customs houses. Perhaps the mental categories we impose, this is commerce, this is religion, this is history, this is myth. Perhaps those didn't operate. Perhaps Dilmun was both, simultaneously, was real place with special status, was actual island that was also sacred, was location you could sail to that was also location of mythological events. The integration seems impossible to us, seems contradictory, but maybe that's our limitation. Maybe ancient peoples didn't experience the contradiction, experienced unity, experienced place as having multiple dimensions, multiple realities, being ordinary and extraordinary at once, being mapped geographically and theologically, being destination for ships and destination for souls, being there and beyond simultaneously. The Sumerians organized their world in concentric circles, Sumer at the center, surrounded by known regions, then by foreign lands, then by mythological places at the edges. The boundaries weren't sharp, weren't absolute. A place could be both foreign land and mythological realm, could be both trade partner and sacred geography. Dilmun was to the east, across the lower sea, what we call the Persian Gulf. In the direction of sunrise, that's significant. East is where sun rises, where light comes from, where day begins. The orientation isn't just practical, is symbolic, is loaded with meaning. The land of sunrise, the bright land, the place where light originates. That's not just geographic description, that's cosmic location, that's theological positioning. Perhaps Dilmun's reality made it suitable for mythological role, perhaps because it was real trading partner, because merchants actually went there, because it could be located and described, that made it perfect vessel for sacred meaning, better than purely imaginary place, better than location no one could find. The reality grounded the myth, made it plausible, made it possible to believe that paradise wasn't just abstract concept, but actual place that existed, that you could theoretically reach, that was out there, somewhere, across the water, difficult to access perhaps, requiring journey, but real, tangible. Not just idea, but location, that combination, real place with sacred status. That's powerful, that's compelling, that's the kind of thing that sustains religious imagination, that makes myth feel true, that creates possibility, that what's sacred can be encountered, can be reached, can be experienced if you're worthy, if you're chosen, if the gods allow. The writing system itself was developing, cuneiform marks pressed into clay, evolving from simple pictographs to complex system capable of expressing abstract ideas, capable of recording trade and theology and poetry and law. The tablets that mention Dilmun, both the commercial and the religious ones, they're written in same script, by same scribal class, often preserved in same archives. The integration is complete. The merchants and priests might have been different people, but they used same language, same writing system, same conceptual framework, lived in same culture that saw no contradiction in Dilmun being both port and paradise, both source of copper and source of immortality, both place where merchants docked and place where gods dwelt. The tablets preserve that unity, that complexity, that refusal to separate practical from sacred, commercial from theological, the real from the mythological. And in preserving it, they pass the mystery to us. Pass the question we're still asking. Was Dilmun real? And if it was, which Dilmun? The one in the trade records? Or the one in the myths? Or both? Or something else we haven't quite understood yet? Something that requires thinking about place and paradise and memory differently than we're accustomed to? The Sumerians named the sacred, named Dilmun, wrote it into permanence, into clay that outlasted them, that speaks to us still, that preserves the name without quite explaining what it meant, what it was, where it was, whether it was real or imagined or both or neither, or something we don't have words for. The tablets wait in museums, silent, patient, holding their ambiguities, refusing to resolve the question cleanly. Or perhaps the distinction is wrong. Perhaps to Sumerians, the separation between practical and sacred didn't exist as we make it. Perhaps trading port could be paradise. Perhaps sacred place could have docks and customs houses. Perhaps the mental categories we impose, this is commerce, this is religion, this is history, this is myth, perhaps those didn't operate. Perhaps Dilmun was both, simultaneously, was real place with special status, was actual island that was also sacred, Was location you could sail to that was also location of mythological events. The integration seems impossible to us, seems contradictory, but maybe that's our limitation. Maybe ancient peoples didn't experience the contradiction. Experienced unity, experienced place as having multiple dimensions, multiple realities, being ordinary and extraordinary at once, being mapped geographically and theologically, being destination for ships and destination for souls, being there and beyond simultaneously. When you read the ancient texts, when you sit with translations of cuneiform tablets pressed 4,000 years ago, you encounter language that's both familiar and strange. The Sumerian poem Enki and Ninhursag describes Dilmun directly, extensively, with details that should clarify but somehow complicate. The opening lines set the scene. The land Dilmun is pure. The land Dilmun is clean. The land Dilmun is bright. The land Dilmun is brilliant. The repetition is emphatic. This isn't casual description. This is establishing essential nature, purity, cleanliness, brightness. These are the qualities that define Dilmun, that make it what it is, that distinguish it from other places. The text continues. Describes what doesn't happen in Dilmun, what's absent, and the absences are telling. In Dilmun, the raven utters no cry. Ravens are scavengers, are associated with death, with carrion, with decay. Their silence means death's absence, means nothing dies, nothing decays, nothing feeds the ravens because nothing ends. The wild hen announces not the hen's cry. This is harder to interpret. Perhaps it means domestication is unnecessary. Perhaps it means reproduction happens without struggle, without the calls and displays that mark mating, without the conflict that characterizes animal life. The text continues listing negations. The lion kills not. The wolf snatches not the lamb. Predation is absent. Violence eliminated. The food chain suspended. Herbivores are safe. Prey animals live without fear. The natural order, as we know it, as we've always known it, doesn't operate in Dilmun. More absences follow. The dove droops not its head. This suggests mourning is absent, grief unknown. The man afflicted with eye disease says not, I am afflicted with eye disease. Sickness doesn't exist. Pain is unknown. The physical suffering that defines much of human experience, that creates the medical traditions, that fills the prayers and petitions, that's absent. The man afflicted with head disease says not, I am afflicted with head disease. The pattern repeats, emphasizes, makes clear that Dilmun is place without suffering, without the ailments that plague humanity everywhere else, without the vulnerability that makes us mortal, makes us human, makes us different from gods who don't sicken, don't age, don't die. Perhaps most significant is what the text says next. No old woman says, I am an old woman. No old man says, I am an old man. Aging is absent. Time doesn't diminish. Youth persists. Or perhaps aging happens, but without decline, without the weakness and pain and approaching death that make old age difficult. The text seems to be describing a place where mortality's normal consequences don't apply, where life continues without degradation, where existence is eternal or nearly eternal, where what kills us elsewhere, sickness, violence, age, simply doesn't happen. This is paradise. This is the golden age. This is the primordial condition before the fall, before suffering entered the world, before death became universal, before paradise was lost. Take a breath here. Let that vision settle. But the text isn't finished. After describing what Dilmun is, what it lacks, the poem describes what happens there. The god Enki arrives. Enki, who is god of fresh water, god of wisdom, god of creation and craft, and the sweet underground waters that make life possible. He comes to Dilmun and finds a problem. There was no water. There was no river water. This is strange, confusing. Dilmun is pure and bright and deathless, but it has no water. How can paradise lack the most essential resource? How can land of eternal life be dry? The contradiction seems impossible, unless, perhaps, the text is describing Dilmun before it becomes fully paradise, before it achieves its perfect state. The story is origin story, is explaining how Dilmun became what it is, how it acquired its special qualities. Enki solves the problem. Utu, standing in heaven, opened for her from the earth's mouth sweet water, from the earth's bosom. The sun god helps, opens source, and fresh water flows, from underground, from aquifer perhaps, from the sweet water below the salt. This is specific, this is geological, this is describing springs. Fresh water rising through salt-saturated earth or salt water, creating oasis, creating habitability, making life possible where it shouldn't be. And this detail, this fresh water from Earth's mouth, this is verifiable. This is what Bahrain has. What makes it special? What made it valuable? The underground aquifer, the springs that flow with fresh sweet water on island surrounded by salt gulf. The correspondence between myth and geography is precise, is striking, is the kind of detail that makes archaeologists pause, makes them wonder if the text preserves real memory, real knowledge of real place with real springs that really solved the problem of water scarcity. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions Dilmun too, in different context, different narrative, but consistently, after the flood, after Utnapishtim survives the deluge that destroys humanity, the gods grant him immortality, make him like them, eternal, and they place him somewhere. They took me and settled me in a faraway place at the mouth of the rivers. This is Dilmun. The text doesn't always name it explicitly, but the tradition identifies this faraway place as Dilmun, as the location where the immortal one dwells, where flood survivor lives eternally, where Gilgamesh travels seeking the secret of immortal life. The journey is difficult, dangerous, crosses waters of death, reaches the land where gods placed the one human who escaped mortality's decree. Again, Dilmun is associated with deathlessness, with special status, with being set apart from normal world where everyone dies. Perhaps the most interesting thing is how varied the references are. Trade texts mention Dilmun as source of commercial goods. Religious texts describe it as paradise. Epic literature places it as destination for immortal ones. Geographical texts locate it to the east, across the lower sea. The multiple genres, the multiple contexts, these suggest Dilmun wasn't invention of single story, wasn't isolated myth, was part of broader cultural knowledge, was location everyone knew about, everyone referenced, everyone incorporated into their own narratives and purposes. This is how real places behave in literature. They appear in trade records and myths and epics. They're mentioned in multiple contexts because they're part of the mental landscape, part of the known world. Whether that means Dilmun was physically real or just culturally real, that's harder to determine. But it wasn't an isolated concept, was integrated into Sumerian worldview at multiple levels, multiple genres, multiple purposes. We may never know exactly what ancient readers understood when they encountered these texts, whether they read them as history or theology or both or neither, whether they believed Dilmun was literal place they could sail to or metaphorical space accessible only to gods and immortals, whether the fresh water springs were real geological features or miraculous divine interventions. The texts allow multiple readings, support multiple interpretations, and perhaps that's intentional. Perhaps the ambiguity is the point. Perhaps Dilmun works precisely because it's both real and mythological, both accessible and distant, both part of known world and beyond it. The texts preserve that complexity, that richness, that refusal to be only one thing, and they pass it to us, pass the question, pass the mystery, pass the possibility that somewhere, across warm Gulf waters, in direction of sunrise, in bright land where fresh water flows from earth, paradise might have existed, might exist still, might be findable if we know where to look, if we can read the text correctly, if we can separate geography from theology, or if we can understand that perhaps, for ancient peoples, geography and theology were never separate, were always unified, were always describing same world where sacred and ordinary coexisted, where merchants and gods both travelled, where paradise was both place you could reach and place you could only dream of. The texts speak, but they speak in riddles, in language that reveals and conceals simultaneously, in words that point toward truth without quite stating it clearly. The paradise waits in the texts, waits between the lines, waits for someone to understand what was meant, what was remembered, what was hoped. When the first European travellers reached Bahrain in the 19th century, when they walked across the island's northern plain, they encountered something unexpected. Mounds. Countless mounds, rising from the earth like waves frozen in stone and sand. Not natural hills, not random accumulations, but deliberately constructed tumuli, burial mounds, spread across the landscape in such density that the horizon seemed made of them, clustered, overlapping, creating a necropolis so vast it defied comprehension. How many graves? Thousands, certainly. Tens of thousands. Perhaps more. Perhaps far more. The counting seemed impossible, the scale overwhelming, and the question was immediate, unavoidable. Who built these? Who was buried here? And why here, on this small island, in such extraordinary numbers? The early reports were fragmentary, travellers' accounts, brief mentions in geographical surveys, nothing systematic, nothing scientific, but the descriptions were consistent. The mounds were everywhere, were the most obvious feature of the northern landscape. Some were large, some small, some isolated, some in clusters so dense you could barely walk between them. The construction was simple, stone chambers covered by earth and rubble, creating dome-shaped structures. Time and weather had eroded many, had opened some, had revealed interior chambers, had exposed the bones and pottery and seals left with the dead. The locals knew about them, had always known, but didn't excavate them systematically, didn't study them. The mounds were just there, part of the landscape, ancient, mysterious, accepted. Perhaps the most intriguing early observation was about seals, small circular stamp seals, found in the mounds, found in the ruins of settlements, found scattered across the island. The seals were distinctive, had unique design, central boss handle on the back, carved designs on the face, ships, palm trees, geometric patterns, animals both real and mythological. The craftsmanship was sophisticated, the materials varied, stone, shell, occasionally metal. These seals didn't look like anything from Mesopotamia, didn't match Persian styles, didn't resemble Indian seals, were something else, something unique, something that suggested Bahrain had its own culture, its own identity, its own artistic tradition. The seals were small, were portable, and crucially, identical seals were being found elsewhere, in Mesopotamia, in excavations at and other Sumerian sites. The connection was clear, undeniable. Whatever culture made these seals, they traded with Sumer, were in contact, were part of the network. In the early 20th century, as archaeology became more systematic, as excavation techniques improved, attention turned to Bahrain. The Portuguese fort at Khalat al-Bahrain was obvious starting point. The fort sat on a massive tell, an artificial mound created by millennia of human occupation, layer upon layer of settlement, each generation building on ruins of the previous, creating elevation, creating stratification, creating the archaeological gold mine that tells represent. Excavations began tentatively, revealed that beneath the Portuguese fort, beneath the Islamic layers, beneath the later civilizations, something much older existed. Walls, streets, buildings, evidence of Bronze Age occupation, evidence of the civilization that created the seals, that built the burial mounds, that might, possibly, be Dilmun. The geographic fit was suggestive. Bahrain is east of Mesopotamia, across the lower sea as texts describe, in the direction of sunrise. The island has fresh water springs, has the underground aquifer that makes habitation possible. The sweet water rising from earth that Enki provided in the myth, that's literally present. That's verifiable geology. The location matches textual descriptions. And the seals, those distinctive Bahrain seals, they were appearing in Mesopotamian contexts, in layers dated to the same period when Dilmun was mentioned in trade texts, around 2500 to 1800 BCE. The correlation was too precise to ignore, too consistent to dismiss. The island where seals were made, where massive burial grounds existed, where Bronze Age civilization clearly flourished, This island was in exactly the right place, had exactly the right timeline, had exactly the right connections, was exactly where Dilmun should be if Dilmun was real place rather than pure mythology. Take a breath. Let that correlation settle. But correlation isn't proof. Geographic fit isn't certainty. The island being in the right place doesn't prove it was the right place. Perhaps Dilmun was elsewhere. Perhaps Bahrain was just another trading partner. Perhaps the seals indicate commercial relationship, but nothing more. Perhaps the massive burial grounds and the freshwater springs and the strategic location are coincidences. Remarkable coincidences. Improbable coincidences. But coincidences nonetheless. The early archaeologists were cautious, were aware that wanting something to be true doesn't make it true, that convenient answers should be questioned, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They had intriguing correlations, suggestive patterns, but not yet proof. Not yet inscription saying, "This is Dilmun." Not yet unambiguous identification. Not yet certainty. The burial mounds became subject of intense interest. Who was buried here? Why so many? The density suggested this wasn't just local population, wasn't just Bahrain residents across normal centuries of occupation. The numbers were too large, the concentration too intense. Some researchers propose that Bahrain was regional burial center, that people from across the Gulf, from southern Mesopotamia, from Arabian coast, came here to bury their dead, or sent their dead here. The mounds became pilgrimage destination, cemetery for the faithful, burial ground for those who could afford it. The idea had precedent. Other cultures created regional cemeteries, sacred burial grounds that drew bodies from wide areas. If Bahrain was believed to be sacred, if it was identified with Dilmun, if burial here conferred special status in afterlife, then the concentration makes sense. Explains the scale. Explains why so many graves in relatively small area. Others suggested different explanation. Perhaps the density is illusion. Perhaps the burial ground was used across extremely long time period. Perhaps thousands of years of burials create appearance of simultaneous density when really it's cumulative. Perhaps population wasn't that large, but time span was enormous. Perhaps what seems like mass cemetery is actually just very old cemetery, used continuously, used for so long that even normal death rate creates thousands upon thousands of graves. The mounds don't all date to same period, span considerable range, early Bronze Age through later periods. The chronology is complex, the dating imprecise. Both explanations might be partly true. Perhaps it was regional cemetery and long-used cemetery. Perhaps both factors contributed. Perhaps the sacredness attracted distant burials, while the local population contributed the majority. Perhaps we'll never know precisely, can only note the scale. Wonder at the commitment. Try to understand what it meant to those who built the mounds, who carried stones, who laid bodies in chambers, who sealed the dead beneath earth and left them for eternity. The seals provided the breakthrough. The distinctive Bahrain seals found in Mesopotamia could be sourced, could be identified as coming from Bahrain specifically, and the context where they appeared, the layers they came from, those could be dated, and the dates matched exactly with the period when Dilmun was most frequently mentioned in Mesopotamian texts. The 3rd millennium BCE, the height of Sumerian civilization, the time of maximum trade, maximum contact, maximum commercial activity across the Gulf. The seals were passport perhaps, were identification, were mark of merchant or official from Dilmun, were carried to Ur and Uruk and other cities, were used to seal documents or goods, were physical evidence of the trading relationship the texts described. The correspondence between textual evidence and material evidence was compelling, was the kind of correlation archaeology seeks, not proof absolute, but strong indication, persuasive argument. The island that made these seals, the island where these seals are most common, this island was almost certainly the Dilmun mentioned in trade documents, was the source of copper and dates, was the intermediate port in Gulf trade, was real place with real economy and real connections. Whether it was also the mythological paradise, that remained unclear, but that it was the practical Dilmun, the commercial Dilmun, that seemed increasingly certain. When Geoffrey Bibby arrived in Bahrain in the 1950s, when the Danish archaeological team began their systematic excavations, the modern understanding of Dilmun finally began to emerge. Bibby was archaeologist with vision, with dedication, with the patience required to work in difficult climate, in region with limited infrastructure, in circumstances that demanded persistence. He'd been drawn to the gulf by the mystery, by the question of Dilmun, by the possibility that mythology might be mappable, that paradise might have coordinates, that the ancient texts might be describing real place that archaeology could find. The burial mounds had been noted for centuries, but no one had excavated systematically, no one had mapped comprehensively, no one had attempted to understand the whole picture. Bibi would change that, would spend decades working in Bahrain, would transform understanding of Gulf archaeology, would give Dilmun physical reality. The team focused on Qalat al-Bahrain, the massive tell on the northern coast. The site was promising, was clearly ancient. The Portuguese fort on top was just latest occupation. Beneath it, layer after layer of earlier settlement waited. The excavation was slow, methodical. This wasn't treasure hunting, was scientific archaeology, recording everything, dating everything, preserving context, understanding stratigraphy. The work was hot. The tell's surface reached punishing temperatures. The dust was constant, the physical labor exhausting, but the results justified the effort. What emerged from the earth was city, actual city, with walls, streets, houses, workshops, temples, public buildings, a Bronze Age urban centre that had flourished for centuries, for over a millennium perhaps. The occupation layers went deep, revealed multiple building phases, multiple periods of destruction and reconstruction, multiple iterations of the city rising and falling and rising again. The city walls were impressive, massive stone fortifications, built and rebuilt across centuries, protecting the settlement, defining its boundaries, creating defended space. The construction was sophisticated, used large blocks, showed understanding of engineering, showed organizational capacity, showed wealth sufficient to invest in monumental defensive architecture. Inside the walls, the residential quarters emerged, houses built around courtyards, rooms arranged for living and working, storage areas for goods, workshops for craft production. The pottery was everywhere, local wares and imported pieces, showing trade connections, showing material culture, showing daily life. The objects were ordinary and extraordinary both. Cooking pots, storage jars, luxury items, seals, weights for commerce, copper implements, everything needed for urban existence. Perhaps most significant were the copper workshops, the evidence of industrial activity. Qalat al-Bahrain was processing copper, importing ore from Magan, modern Oman, refining it, creating ingots and finished goods, shipping the processed copper to Mesopotamia. The scale was substantial. This was major industry, major economic activity. The textual references to Dilmun as source of copper, those were verified, made material, made tangible in the slag and crucibles and workshop floors. The trade the text described, the commercial relationship, it happened here. In these workshops, on these streets, through these walls and gates, the city was the physical manifestation of the trade network, was the hub, the connection point, the place where goods from east met demand from west, where Indus products transferred to Mesopotamian merchants, where Omani copper was processed and shipped, where dates and pearls and precious woods changed hands, where commerce created wealth, created civilization, created the cultural flowering that archaeology was revealing. The temples were remarkable, built around water, around the fresh springs that made Bahrain habitable. The Barbar temple complex, excavated separately but contemporary, showed elaborate religious architecture, stone construction, multiple building phases, offering pools, ritual spaces, evidence of worship spanning centuries. The dedication to water god, to Enki, seemed clear. The temple orientation, the sacred pools, the association with springs, everything pointed to water worship, to the theology of fresh water in salt sea, to the miracle that Enki's myth described, sweet water rising from earth, made physical, made architectural, made into permanent religious center. The correlation between myth and material culture was precise, was the kind of thing that makes archaeologists reconsider assumptions, makes them wonder if texts preserve more reality than credited, makes them question the boundary between mythology and history. Take a breath here. rest with these discoveries. Bibby's team also found inscriptions, not many, not as many as hoped, but some, fragmentary texts, references that might be place names, scripts that mixed cuneiform influences with local developments. The writing wasn't abundant enough to provide complete picture, wasn't clear enough to resolve all questions, but suggested literacy, suggested administrative complexity, suggested cultural sophistication matching the architecture and material culture. The city wasn't just trading post, was center, was capital perhaps, was the heart of civilization that called itself what? The inscriptions were too fragmentary to say definitively, but the location, the timeline, the material culture, everything suggested this was Dilmun, the practical Dilmun, the trading Dilmun, the real civilization that existed independent of mythological associations. The chronology was established through pottery and seals and architectural styles. The city flourished from approximately 2300 BCE to 1800 BCE. This was the Golden Age, the period of maximum prosperity, maximum trade, maximum cultural achievement, the period when Dilmun was most frequently mentioned in Mesopotamian texts. The correspondence was exact. When text said Dilmun was important trading partner, archaeology showed thriving commercial center. When text said Dilmun supplied copper, archaeology showed copper processing. When text said Dilmun was east across the lower sea, archaeology showed island city in exactly that location. The fit was too good to dismiss, too consistent to attribute to chance. Bahrain was Dilmun, or at least, Bahrain was one Dilmun, the commercial Dilmun, the historical Dilmun, the real place that real merchants really visited. Whether it was also the mythological paradise that remained unproven, but that it was the practical trade hub mentioned in economic texts that seemed established, seemed verified, seemed as certain as archaeology can make such identifications. The excavations continued, are continuing still. Each season reveals more walls, more streets, more artifacts. The site is enormous, covers hectares. Most remains unexcavated. Most waits beneath earth and later occupation. Most hold secrets still, questions still. The work is ongoing, is incomplete, is the project of generations. What Bibby started in the 1950s continues today, with better techniques, better technology, better funding, better understanding, but the fundamental questions remain. How large was the city? How many people lived here? What was social structure? What was governance system? How did trade actually function? How did religious and commercial aspects integrate? How did this island city manage to punch above its weight, to be a significant player in Bronze Age world economy, to be mentioned consistently in Mesopotamian texts, to be remembered, to be important, to matter enough that mythology and history both preserve its name? The archaeology provides answers, but raises more questions, shows us Dilmun was real, but doesn't quite explain why it mattered so much, why it became paradise, why commercial success translated into sacred geography, why trading hub became land of eternal life. The material culture is impressive, but doesn't quite account for the mythology, doesn't explain the leap from copper shipments to deathless garden, the gap between what archaeology finds and what texts describe. That gap remains, that mystery persists, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps some questions don't have archaeological answers. Perhaps material culture can verify trade and architecture and chronology, but can't verify belief, can't measure sacredness, can't weigh mythology, can't excavate the meaning that made this place special beyond its commercial function. The city waits in the earth, partly exposed, partly hidden, holding both answers and mysteries, both evidence and ambiguity, both verification and questions that verification raises but cannot resolve. Let me tell you about a moment, about a hot afternoon in Bahrain in 1958, about an archaeologist named P.V. Glob standing in a burial mound with a brush in his hand, about what happens when object emerges from Earth after 4,000 years of darkness, about recognition, about connection across time, about the instant when past becomes tangible, when history becomes something you can hold. Glob was part of Bibby's team, was excavating burial mounds systematically, documenting construction techniques, recording grave goods, building understanding of burial practices. The work was repetitive, was physically demanding. The mounds were numerous. Each one required careful excavation, removing earth, exposing stone chamber, recording position of bones and artifacts. The heat was relentless, the dust constant, the labor exhausting, but necessary, essential. This was science. This was how knowledge was built, through patient methodical work, through attention to detail, through recording everything even when most details seemed unremarkable. This particular mound was typical, mid-sized. Nothing about its exterior suggested anything special. The stone chamber was standard construction. The skeleton was badly preserved. The pottery was ordinary. But there, near where the left hand would have been, something caught the light, something small, something circular. Glob brushed carefully, exposed more, used smaller tools, took his time, and gradually, patiently, the object emerged, a seal, circular, about 3 centimeters across, made of soft stone, steatite probably, with characteristic boss handle on the back, and on the face, carved with remarkable skill, a scene. The carving showed a boat, a distinctive gulf vessel, high prow, high stern, central cabin or cargo area, oars visible. This was Tao Ancestor, the ship design that would dominate Gulf waters for millennia. But this was ancient version, Bronze Age rendering, 4,000 years old. The detail was extraordinary. The lines were clean, the proportions accurate. This was carved by someone who knew boats, who understood their structure, who had seen them, sailed in them perhaps. The ship was flanked by symbols, geometric patterns, hatching that might represent waves, might represent sky, might mean something else entirely. The iconography was rich, was complex, was saying something, communicating something. If only we could read it properly. If only we understood the visual language. If only the symbols were transparent across 4 millennia instead of enigmatic. Glob held the seal carefully, turned it in the light, felt its weight, its smoothness. The stone was worn, was polished by centuries of handling, by being carried, used, pressed into clay to make impressions. This wasn't just burial good, was something used in life, was tool, was possession, was mark of identity perhaps. The handle fit naturally in his palm. He could imagine pressing it, making impression, sealing document or goods, marking ownership, creating authentication. The seal was small, was portable, but was powerful, was authority, was identity, was the Bronze Age equivalent of signature, of passport, of proof of who you were and where you came from. Take a breath, feel that connection. What made this seal significant? What made this moment matter? Was recognition. Glob had seen seals like this before, in museums, in archaeological publications, in finds from Mesopotamia, from Ur especially, seals with identical design elements, identical style, identical manufacturing techniques. But those seals had been found far from Bahrain, had been found in Sumerian contexts, and the question had always been, where did they come from? Who made them? Who brought them to Mesopotamia? Now, holding this seal in burial mound in Bahrain, the answer was clear. These seals were made here, on this island, were local production, were Bahrain's distinctive contribution to Bronze Age material culture. And they'd travelled, had been carried to Mesopotamia, had been used there, had been deposited in archaeological contexts that could be dated, that could be correlated with textual evidence, that could connect material culture to written history. The implications were immediate. This seal, and hundreds like it found in Bahrain burial mounds and settlement sites, these proved Bahrain was production centre, was source, was origin point, and the contexts where identical seals appeared in Mesopotamia, those dated to 2500, 1800 BCE, the exact period when Dilmun was most frequently mentioned in trade texts, the exact period when copper and dates and precious goods were flowing from Dilmun to Ur. The seals were the physical evidence, were the material proof, were the archaeological verification of textual claims. The merchants who carried these seals were Dilmun merchants. The goods they sealed were Dilmun goods. The trade relationship the tablets described was real, was tangible, was verified by these small circular objects that travelled across the Gulf and survived into the present to tell their stories. Glob documented everything, photographed the seal in situ, recorded its position relative to the skeleton, noted the other grave goods, the pottery, the copper pins, the beads. Everything was recorded, everything was preserved in field notes, everything became part of the scientific record. The seal was cleaned carefully, was catalogued, was photographed again in better light, was drawn, the carving was analysed, the iconography studied, the manufacturing technique examined. It joined hundreds of other seals from other mounds, from settlement excavations, from decades of archaeological work in Bahrain. Each seal was evidence, each was data point, each contributed to understanding the culture that produced them, the civilization that lived here, that traded across the Gulf, that built cities and temples, that buried tens of thousands of dead in massive necropolis, that called itself what? The seals didn't answer that question, didn't have text saying made in Dilmun, didn't provide absolute proof of name, but they provided something almost as good, provided physical link, provided material culture that connected Bahrain to Mesopotamia during exact period when Dilmun was important, provided evidence of identity, of distinctive culture, of artistic tradition unique to this island. The seals were fingerprint, were signature, were proof that Bahrain wasn't passive recipient of trade but active participant, wasn't just way station but centre, wasn't just convenient location but cultural entity. The people who made these seals, who carved these boats and palms and geometric patterns, they knew who they were, had identity, had pride perhaps, had artistic vision, had the skill and resources to create thousands of these objects, to distribute them widely, to make them known across Bronze Age world. Glob packed the seal carefully. It would go to museum, would be studied, would be published, would join the growing body of evidence about Bahrain's Bronze Age past, about the civilization that might be Dilmun. The moment passed, the excavation continued. Other mounds waited, other graves, other artifacts. The work went on, but something had shifted, not dramatically, not suddenly, but incrementally. The evidence was accumulating, the picture was forming, the scattered pieces were assembling into coherent whole. Bahrain was Dilmun, or at least, Bahrain was where Dilmun happened, where the trading happened, where the copper was processed, where the merchants who used these seals were based, where the Bronze Age prosperity was centered, whether it was also paradise, whether the mythological Dilmun and the commercial Dilmun were same place or different places or same place understood differently, that remained unclear. But that this island, this tell, this burial ground, this collection of seals and copper and pottery and bones, that this was connected to the Dilmun of ancient texts, that seemed increasingly undeniable. The seals told stories, not in words, not in text we could read directly, but in style, in distribution, in context, in the connections they made visible between island and mainland, between Bahrain and Sumer, between material culture and textual reference, between what was written and what was made. The stories weren't complete, weren't definitive, left questions, left ambiguities, but they were stories nonetheless, were evidence, were the physical traces of people who lived and traded and died, who left these objects behind, who didn't know, couldn't know, that 4,000 years later someone would hold their seal and wonder, would feel across time, would try to understand, would ask whether this island was paradise, whether these graves held people who believed they were buried in land of eternal life, whether the fresh water flowing from the springs was just geology or was miracle, whether Dilmun was real or myth or both or something we still don't have words for. When you imagine life in Dilmun at its height, around 2300 BCE, imagine waking to warmth, the sun rising over the Gulf waters, light spreading across the island, the heat building slowly but inevitably. This is your world, this island, these streets, these walls. You've known nothing else. Your parents lived here, your grandparents. The generations stretch back into memory that becomes story, becomes legend, becomes the time when the gods first made the island habitable, when Enki brought the sweet water, when paradise began. The city wakes with you, doors opening, people emerging into streets, the merchants preparing for the day, the craftsmen heading to workshops, the sailors checking boats in the harbour, the priests moving toward the temple. The rhythms are established, are familiar, are the pattern that organizes existence. You know where you fit, what your role is, what the day requires. The social structure is clear. The merchants are wealthy, control the trade, make the deals that bring copper from Magan and take it to Ur. The craftsmen are skilled, make the pottery and seals and copper goods that define material culture. The priests mediate between human and divine, maintain the temples, perform the rituals, keep the sacred springs pure. And below these, the labourers, the sailors, the workers who move goods and build walls and dig wells and do the physical work that makes everything else possible. Your house is typical, built around small courtyard, mud brick walls, flat roof, simple, functional. The courtyard provides private outdoor space, where cooking happens, where children play, where evening brings slight cooling and the family gathers. The rooms are small, are for sleeping mostly, for storing possessions. The pottery jars hold water, grain, dates. The copper pins and beads and tools are precious. Our wealth, our inheritance, the seals. If your family owns seal, that's authority, that's identity, that's proof of status. That's what you press into clay to mark your goods, your documents, your participation in the commercial world that makes Dilmun matter. The fresh water is gift, is miracle, is what makes life possible. The springs flow constantly, sweet water rising from underground aquifer, accessible through wells, through channels, through the careful management that distributes it to neighbourhoods, to fields, to the date palm groves that provide food and shade and export goods. The water is sacred and practical both, is divine provision and essential resource. The temples built around the springs acknowledge this. Make physical the theology, make architectural the gratitude. The priests who tend the pools and perform the purification rituals, they're maintaining relationship with Enki, with the god who solved the water problem, who made Dilmun habitable, who transformed dry land into paradise, or so the stories say. The stories you grew up with, the stories that explain why this place is special, why you're blessed, why life here is good when life elsewhere is harder. Perhaps you work in the copper trade. Perhaps you're part of the workshops that process ore from Magan. The ore arrives by ship, dark, heavy stones, carrying potential, carrying wealth. Your job is transformation, is heating the ore in furnaces, separating copper from slag, pouring molten metal into moulds, creating ingots, creating finished goods, pins, tools, weapons, vessels. The work is hot, is skilled, requires knowledge passed from master to apprentice, requires understanding of temperatures and timing and techniques. The copper you produce will travel, will go north to Mesopotamia, will become jewelry in Ur, will become tools in Uruk, will carry Dilmun's reputation, will prove your island is essential, is valuable, is the link in the chain that connects East and West. That makes Bronze Age globalization possible. Take a breath. Rest in that daily work. The market is busy, always busy. Goods arriving from ships, goods being sorted, weighed, distributed. The weights are standardized, are crucial for fair trade, for maintaining reputation, for ensuring that measures in Dilmun match measures in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. The system is sophisticated, is international. The merchants speak multiple languages, perhaps. No Sumerian for dealing with northern traders, no local dialect, know enough of Eastern languages to negotiate with Indus merchants. The communication is essential, is the skill that makes trade possible, that transforms goods into wealth, that makes Dilmun more than just island, makes it hub, makes it necessary, makes it the place ships must stop, the place deals must be made, the place that can't be bypassed. The evening brings relief, slight cooling, the sun setting over the gulf, families gathering, meals being prepared, the smell of cooking, of fish and dates and bread, the taste of fresh water, the sound of voices, children playing, adults discussing the day, the gossip, the news from arriving ships, the stories about distant lands, about Ur's grandeur, about the Indus cities, about the trade routes and the prices and the demand for copper that keeps prosperity flowing. The conversations are comfortable, are familiar, are the way community maintains itself, shares information, reinforces bonds, creates the social fabric that's as important as walls or harbours or workshops. That makes collection of individuals into civilization, into place with identity, into Dilmun. The stars emerge, slowly, as darkness deepens. The same stars ancient astronomers watch from ziggurats in Mesopotamia. The same constellations, the same patterns. Perhaps you know some names. Perhaps the priests have taught you about celestial navigation, about how sailors find their way, about how the stars mark seasons, about how the heavens reflect divine order. The knowledge might be practical, might be sacred, might be both. The boundary isn't clear, isn't necessary. You know enough to orient yourself, to know when seasons are changing, to feel connected to something larger, to sense that the island, your home, is part of cosmic pattern, is positioned correctly, is blessed by geography and theology both, is paradise perhaps, or is echo of paradise, or is ordinary place made special by belief and prosperity and the sweet water that shouldn't exist but does. The night settles, the family sleeps, and tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, and the year after. The pattern feels eternal, feels unchanging, but this won't last forever. Nothing does. Already the seeds of change are present. Already the trade routes are shifting. Already the great powers are evolving. But tonight, in this moment, in this golden age that won't be recognized as golden until it's gone, life continues, stable, prosperous, connected to world beyond while rooted in this small island, this home, this Dilmun. When you approach the Barber Temple, when you walk the path that leads to sacred precinct, you're moving from ordinary world to extraordinary space. The transition is gradual but deliberate. The temple complex sits slightly elevated, slightly apart, not isolated completely but separated enough, marked enough, different enough that crossing into it feels significant, feels like entering different realm, where normal rules might not apply, where human meets divine, where the springs that should not exist but do, where those springs become theological statement, become architecture, become permanent reminder that this island is blessed, is special, is place where miracle happened and continues happening every day the water flows. The temple is built of limestone blocks, not mud brick like houses, not the temporary material, but stone, permanent, solid, heavy blocks brought from quarries, shaped, fitted, built into walls that will last, that will outlast the builders, that will carry the sacred into future. The construction is impressive, shows organization, shows wealth sufficient to invest in monumental architecture, shows commitment, shows belief that this place, this spring, this divine presence deserves the best, deserves permanence, deserves structures worthy of the God who dwells here, of Enki, of the sweet water god, of the deity who made Dilmun habitable, who solved the impossible problem, who gave gift that makes life possible. The temple has multiple courts, multiple levels, multiple building phases, showing that successive generations rebuilt, expanded, improved. The earliest temple was simpler, smaller, but each reconstruction made it grander, more elaborate, more worthy. The process shows continuity, shows that religious dedication didn't waver, that each generation felt compelled to honor what came before while adding their own contribution, their own devotion, their own resources. The archaeology reveals this, shows the layers, shows how the sacred space evolved while maintaining essential character, essential purpose, essential orientation toward the springs, toward the water, toward the miracle. The central feature is the pool. Built around natural spring, the water rises here, emerges from earth into carefully constructed basin. The pool is rectangular, is lined with stone, is accessed by steps. The water is clear, is cool, is sweet, is everything seawater, is not. The contrast is profound, is the foundation of the theology. All around is salt, the gulf is salt. The very existence depends on salt water that surrounds, but here, in this spot, fresh water, drinkable water, life-giving water. The miracle is geological, is hydrological, is the underground aquifer that feeds the spring. But to ancient peoples, to those who built the temple, the miracle is divine, is Enki's gift, is proof that gods are real, that prayers are heard, that Dilmun is blessed. Imagine standing here, at the temple, in the cool of early morning before heat builds. The priests are performing morning rituals. You've come for purification. for blessing, for participation in the sacred. The water draws you, calls you. The priests chant. The language is formal, ancient perhaps. Words that carry meaning beyond their literal sense. Words that connect this moment to all previous moments, that make this ritual instance of eternal pattern. You descend the steps. The stone is cool beneath your feet, smooth, worn by countless others who've descended before. The water is shockingly cold, is refreshing, is alive in ways that still water is not, is moving, flowing, connected to source beneath, connected to aquifer, to underground river, to the sweet water that Enki commands. Take a breath, feel that immersion. The purification is complete. You emerge. The priests bless you. You've participated in sacred, have connected to divine, have experienced the miracle directly, not through story, not through second-hand account, but physically, tangibly. The water on your skin, the cold that fades slowly in the warm air, the sense of renewal, of cleansing, of being made right, made pure, made worthy. The ritual isn't just symbolic, isn't just psychological, it's experiential. It's physical encounter with the extraordinary, with the water that shouldn't exist. That proves Dilmun is special, is blessed, is paradise or remnant of paradise or echo of paradise or whatever category makes sense of the feeling that this place is different, is more, is touched by divine in ways that validate the myths, that make the ancient stories seem less like stories and more like memories, more like truth preserved in narrative form. The temple receives offerings constantly, copper objects, pottery, food, incense. The worshippers bring what they have, what they can afford, what seems appropriate to thank the god for the water, for the blessing, for making life possible on this small island in vast salt gulf. The priests accept the offerings, distribute some to temple workers, to the community that depends on temple economy, store some as temple wealth, as reserve, as insurance against difficult times. Dedicate some to the god directly. The system is economic and religious both, is practical and sacred, is the integration that defines ancient societies. That makes every transaction meaningful, every exchange part of larger pattern, every gift simultaneously offering to God and contribution to community. The temple is center, is hub, is where spiritual and material meet, where divine and human interact, where the springs make everything possible. The architecture speaks. Not in words, but in space, in proportion, in the careful construction that honors both engineering and theology. The building is oriented, is aligned perhaps to solar events, to solstices or equinoxes. The archaeology suggests this, but doesn't prove it. The evidence is suggestive, but not definitive. Perhaps the builders cared about astronomical alignment. Perhaps they oriented to sunrise, to the direction of light, to the east where Dilmun is located from Mesopotamian perspective, where bright land is, where the sun and the sacred converge. Or perhaps the orientation is practical, is about water flow, about drainage, about structural considerations, or perhaps both. Perhaps the practical and sacred are unified, are inseparable, are what they always were before we learned to split them, before we made theology one thing and engineering another. Before we forgot that for ancient peoples, all of it was sacred, all of it mattered, all of it connected to divine reality that permeated existence. But this would not last forever. The temple would be built and rebuilt for centuries, but eventually the rebuilding would stop, the offerings would decrease, the worship would diminish, the springs would continue flowing. They flow today, but the sacred interpretation would fade. The temple would be abandoned, would fall into ruin, would be buried by time and sand, would wait in darkness until modern archaeology would excavate it, would expose the courts and the pool and the limestone blocks, would reveal the dedication, would show us what Bronze Age peoples built when they believed they were building for God, when they believed the springs were miracle, when they believed Dilmun was paradise, or as close to paradise as humans could reach. The temple waits, partly excavated, partly restored, partly still hidden, still holding secrets about belief and practice and the daily rituals that maintained relationship between humans and divine, between island and cosmos, between the water that flows and the God who made it flow. The springs still rise, still sweet, still cold, still impossible, still suggesting that paradise, whatever paradise means, might be more than myth, might be memory, might be the name we give to places where the impossible happens, where the miracle continues, where the extraordinary becomes so ordinary we forget to wonder until we stand at the ancient temple, until we see the pool, until we remember that once people believed this water was divine gift, was proof of blessing, was evidence that Dilmun was special, and perhaps they were right. Let me tell you about someone. We'll call him Enlil Nadin. The name is Sumerian, means Enlil gives. Whether anyone actually had this name in Dilmun, we don't know. But it fits. It's the kind of name that would travel. That would be understood in both Dilmun and That would mark its bearer as someone who moves between worlds, who understands trade, who speaks both languages, who carries goods and information and cultural connection across the waters. Enlil Nadin is merchant, has been merchant for 20 years, learned the trade from his father, is teaching his son. This is how knowledge transmits, how commercial relationships persist, how trust builds across generations. Your father traded with this Mesopotamian house. You trade with them now. Your son will trade with them next. The continuity matters as much as the goods, perhaps more, because goods can be acquired anywhere, but relationships, trust, the knowledge of who keeps their word, that's irreplaceable. That's what makes trade possible. That's what transforms transaction into partnership, into the networks that span the Bronze Age world. Today, Enlil Nadin is preparing for voyage. He's been in Dilmun for 3 months, has assembled the cargo, the copper ingots bought from the processing workshops, smelted from Magan ore, formed into standard weights. Each ingot represents value, represents labour, represents the chain of production that starts with miners in Oman and ends with craftsmen in He also has dates, dried, preserved, packed in baskets. Dates grow well in Dilmun. The fresh water feeds the palm groves. The climate is favourable. The crop is reliable. And Mesopotamia wants them, always wants them. Dates keep. Dates travel. Dates are currency. Our food, our sweetness in world with limited sugar. The cargo also includes luxury items. Carnelian beads from the Indus Valley. Precious woods, items that passed through Dilmun from further east, items that Enlil Nadin acquired from other merchants, items that carry premium prices in Mesopotamia because they're exotic, rare, beautiful, hard to get. The ship is loaded, the Tao ancestor, high prow, high stern, sturdy construction, built for Gulf waters, built for carrying cargo, built for the voyage that Enlil Nadin has made hundreds of times. The crew is ready, sailors who know the route, who know the winds, who know the stars they'll navigate by when night comes. The departure is routine, is ordinary, but Enlil Nadin still feels anticipation, still feels the excitement that comes with voyage, with leaving the island, with crossing water, with travelling toward different worlds, toward Mesopotamia, toward toward the cities that dwarf Dilmun, that make his island home seem small, provincial, but necessary, always necessary, because needs what Dilmun provides, needs the copper, needs the intermediary position, needs the merchants like Enlil Nadin who make the trade work. The voyage takes days, the wind is favourable, the Gulf is calm, the ship moves steadily northward, the crew works, adjusts sails, manages cargo, prepares meals, tells stories. The time passes slowly, comfortably. Enlil Nadin watches the water, watches the distant coastline, thinks about the deals he'll make, the prices he'll negotiate, the relationships he'll maintain, the gossip he'll hear, the news from Mesopotamia that he'll carry back to Dilmun. The role is crucial, isn't just about goods, is about information, about connection, about being the link, the bridge, the one who knows both worlds, who can explain one to the other, who makes understanding possible across cultural difference, across language barrier, across the water that separates. Take a breath, feel that journey. Arriving at is overwhelming, even after hundreds of times. The city is vast, is crowded, is loud, is everything Dilmun is not. The population numbers in tens of thousands. The buildings rise high. The ziggurat dominates, touches sky, marks the city from distance, announces its presence, its power, its dedication to gods. The harbour is busy, ships from everywhere, from up and down Mesopotamia, from the Gulf, from different worlds, all converging, all bringing goods, all participating in the trade that makes wealthy. That makes it centre, that makes it matter. Enlil Nadine docks, oversees the unloading. His contact is waiting, the merchant house he's dealt with for years. The greeting is formal, but warm. Business first, then friendship. The copper is weighed, the dates inspected, the luxury items examined. The prices are negotiated, the process is familiar, has patterns, has expectations, has the rhythm of established relationship. The deals are made, the goods transferred, payment is arranged, in silver, in trade goods, in the complex exchanges that move value without coins, without currency in modern sense. The system works, has worked for centuries, will work for centuries more, is the infrastructure that makes Bronze Age economy function. The evening brings celebration, dinner with the merchant house, with their family. Stories are exchanged, news shared. Enlil Nadin tells about Dilmun, about the temple renovations, about the successful trade season, about his son's coming of age, about the ordinary life of island merchant city. His hosts tell about about political intrigue, about religious festivals, about the king's building projects, about the wars and alliances and the vast complicated politics of Mesopotamian city-states. Enlil Nadin listens, absorbs, files away the information. This is valuable, is what he'll share when he returns, is what makes him important in Dilmun, not just because he brings goods, but because he brings knowledge, brings understanding of the larger world, brings the sense that Dilmun is connected, is part of something bigger, is known, is valued, is necessary. The stars are different here, not in position, but in context, in meaning. In Dilmun, the stars are comfortable, familiar, are the markers of seasons and navigation, but in the stars are science, are religion, are tracked by priest astronomers from the ziggurat, are incorporated into complex astrological systems, are read as omens, as divine writing, as messages from gods about earthly affairs. Enlil Nadin doesn't understand it completely, doesn't need to, but he's aware, knows that Mesopotamians see the sky differently, know it more deeply, organize around it more completely. The sophistication is impressive, is part of what makes these cities great, what makes them centers, what makes them powerful. The knowledge, the systematic observation, the institutional continuity, the resources dedicated to understanding, to recording, to building on what previous generations learned. Dilmun has nothing like this, is smaller, simpler, more focused on practical, but that's fine. That's appropriate. Dilmun is port, is intermediary, is connection point, not center, not capital, but essential link. And Enlil Nadin is proud of that, proud of his role, proud of his island, proud that he's part of the network, part of the system, part of what makes the Bronze Age world function. After several days, the business complete. Enlil Nadin prepares to return. The ship is loaded with different cargo now. Mesopotamian goods, textiles, pottery, grain, items that Dilmun needs, items that the island can't produce itself. The reciprocal trade, the exchange that makes both sides better, that creates interdependence, that makes peace more valuable than war, that creates relationships stronger than momentary profit. The voyage home is peaceful, is satisfying, is the completion of cycle. Enlil Nadin has done his work, has served his role, has maintained the connections, has kept the trade flowing, has proven once again that Dilmun matters, that the island is necessary, that paradise, or whatever Dilmun is, continues because people like him make it possible, make it real, make it more than myth, more than memory, make it living place, working port, functioning civilization, connected to world, essential to economy, important to Bronze Age globalization. The journey continues, will continue, as long as ships sail, as long as copper is needed, as long as Dilmun has fresh water and strategic position and merchants brave enough to cross the Gulf, as long as paradise, practical paradise, commercial paradise, serves its purpose, connects east and west, brings distant worlds into relationship, makes trade possible, makes prosperity real, makes Dilmun matter. When Dilmun reached its peak, between 2300 and 1800 BCE, it was not empire, was not kingdom in the way or Akkad were kingdoms, was something different, something more modest in political structure but no less significant in economic function. Dilmun was merchant republic, perhaps, was commercial hub, was place where wealth came from trade, not from conquest, where power came from relationships, not from armies, where success was measured in cargo moved and deals completed, not in territory controlled. The scale was human, was manageable, was the kind of organization that could function on small island with limited population, that could punch above its weight through intelligence and positioning and the practical knowledge that makes trade possible. The ruler, whoever ruled, we're not entirely certain of the title. The ruler was primus inter pares, perhaps, first among equals. The head merchant, the one whose family had built the most connections, who commanded the most resources, who could coordinate the trade that enriched everyone. The political structure wasn't centralized like Mesopotamian kingdoms, wasn't divine kingship, wasn't absolute authority, was more subtle, more negotiated, more dependent on consensus among the merchant families who controlled the economy, who owned the ships and workshops and warehouses, who made the deals and managed the relationships and maintained the networks. The ruler needed their cooperation, needed their support, governed through persuasion more than command, through organizing collective action more than imposing individual will. The evidence suggests independence, suggests that Dilmun wasn't colony, wasn't controlled by Mesopotamia despite trading primarily with Mesopotamian cities, maintained autonomy, maintained separate identity. The seals are distinctive, the material culture is unique, the artistic style is Dilmun's own. This matters. This shows that commercial relationship didn't require political submission, that trade could flourish without colonization, that small place could maintain sovereignty while being integrated into larger economic system. The relationship was symbiotic, was mutually beneficial. Mesopotamia needed Dilmun's copper and intermediary role. Dilmun needed Mesopotamia's grain and textiles and market. Neither could thrive without the other, but neither controlled the other. The balance was unusual, was perhaps fragile, but it worked. For centuries it worked. The trilateral trade was sophisticated, Mesopotamia to Dilmun to the Indus Valley, and back, goods moving in both directions, copper from Magan, modern Oman, carnelian beads from the Indus, textiles and grain from Mesopotamia, dates and processed copper from Dilmun. The trade routes were established, were maintained by merchants like Enlil Nadin, by ships and sailors and the accumulated knowledge of winds and currents and harbours, by relationships that spanned generations, by trust that was earned and maintained, by the system that made Bronze Age globalization possible, that connected civilizations across thousands of kilometers, that moved goods and ideas and cultural influence, that created the interconnected world that thrived for centuries until disruptions came, until the system broke, until the Bronze Age ended and everything collapsed and the connections severed and Dilmun's golden age ended. Perhaps the most impressive thing was the standardization, the weights and measures, the seals that authenticated, the systems that made trade predictable, that made fraud harder, that made trust possible even between strangers. The weights found in Dilmun match weights from Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. The correlation is too precise to be accidental, shows coordination, shows agreement, shows the Bronze Age equivalent of international standards. The merchants needed this, needed to know that a shekel in Dilmun equaled a shekel in Ur. That measures were consistent, that promises were enforceable through shared understanding. The standardization was technological achievement, was organizational triumph, was proof that even Bronze Age peoples could create systems that functioned across vast distances, that managed complexity without computers or telecommunications, that built trust through repeated interaction and reputation and the patient accumulation of reliable relationships. Take a breath, rest with that achievement. The literacy was functional, not widespread perhaps, but sufficient. The merchants could write, could record transactions, could send letters, could maintain accounts. The writing system used Akkadian cuneiform mostly, the language of Mesopotamian trade, the lingua franca, but evidence suggests local script too, undeciphered still, fragmentary, but present, suggesting that Dilmun had its own written tradition alongside the international one. had ways of recording in local language, in local symbols, in forms that served internal needs, even while using Mesopotamian writing for external communication. The bilingualism was practical, was necessary, was the kind of adaptation that successful commercial cultures make, that allows them to participate in wider world without losing distinctive identity, that lets them be both local and international, both rooted and connected, both themselves and part of something larger. But this golden age was already passing, already changing. The political situation in Mesopotamia was unstable. Kingdoms rose and fell, trade routes shifted. The Indus Valley civilization was approaching its own mysterious decline. The demand for copper was fluctuating. New sources were being developed, alternative routes explored. Dilmun's monopoly was weakening. The island remained important, remained prosperous, but the peak had passed. The maximum wealth, the maximum influence, the period when Dilmun was absolutely essential, that was ending, slowly, gradually, but inevitably. The merchants didn't know this, perhaps, didn't recognize the signs, thought the prosperity was permanent, was sustainable, was how things would always be. But empires rise and fall, trade routes shift, and small places dependent on their position in larger systems, those are vulnerable, are subject to forces they can't control, can't predict, can only adapt to when change comes. The burial mounds continued being built, the tens of thousands of graves, the massive investment in honoring the dead, in maintaining the reputation as sacred burial ground, as land of the living, as place where eternal life might be possible. Whether Bronze Age peoples literally believed this, or whether it was metaphor, or whether the distinction between literal and metaphorical wasn't relevant, we can't know. But the practice continued. The dedication to burial, to making Dilmun the place where the dead found rest, found peace, found whatever came after. The belief sustained the practice sustained the identity. The identity made Dilmun more than just trading port, made it sacred space, made it place that mattered beyond economics, beyond practical function, made it place with meaning, with weight, with the kind of significance that transforms geography into sacred geography, that transforms island into paradise, or echo of paradise, or the place where paradise was remembered, was honoured, was maintained as possibility, as hope, as the belief that somewhere, somehow, death could be conquered, suffering could be eliminated, paradise could be achieved, or at least approached, or at least glimpsed, in the sweet water rising from earth, in the date palms growing despite the heat, in the trade that brought prosperity, in the burials that brought peace, in the island that somehow, against the odds, survived, flourished, mattered, became Dilmun, became the bright land, became the pure place, became what the texts described and what archaeology reveals, both ordinary and extraordinary, both practical and sacred, both clearly visible and deeply mysterious. The Golden Age was real, was tangible, was these streets and walls and graves. But what made it golden? What made it special? What made it paradise? That remains hidden, remains the question we're still asking, still exploring, still wondering whether we'll ever answer. Beneath the commercial success, hidden in the geology and geography that made Dilmun possible, lies something more profound, something that might explain why this particular island became paradise, why this location, and not others, became sacred, became the place where gods dwelt and myths originated. The answer might be physical, might be environmental, might be the rare combination of features that made Bahrain extraordinary, that made it feel like miracle, like divine intervention, like proof that the cosmos cared about this small island in vast salt sea. The fresh water is the beginning, is the foundation. The underground aquifer that feeds the springs is geological reality, is hydrological fact, but the experience of it, the encountering of sweet water on island surrounded by salt, that transcends geology, that feels impossible. That creates the sense that natural law has been suspended, that something supernatural is occurring. The water rises from depth, from the sweet water layer beneath the salt, from the aquifer that extends under the Gulf, that connects Bahrain to the Arabian mainland underground. The flow is constant, is reliable, has been flowing for thousands of years, probably tens of thousands, probably since the island emerged from rising seas. The springs made habitation possible, made settlement feasible, made Dilmun real. But perhaps they made it more than real. Perhaps the springs made it sacred, made it feel touched by divine, because water is life, is essential, is the difference between habitable and uninhabitable. On small island in Gulf where every drop matters, where drought means death, where survival depends absolutely on water access, the springs are not just convenient, are miraculous, are evidence that something cares, that the island is blessed, that providence, or Enki, or geological accident that feels like providence, has chosen this place, has made it special, has given it the gift that makes everything else possible. The theology grows naturally from the geography. The mythology emerges from the material reality. The sacred geography is rooted in actual geography, in the features that make this place objectively different from surrounding regions. The strategic location matters too. Bahrain sits roughly midway between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, is positioned perfectly for intermediary trade, for being the stopping point, the resupply station, the market where goods transfer. The positioning isn't unique. Other islands exist in the Gulf, but Bahrain has the water, has the resources, has the combination of location and habitability that made it the choice, the natural choice, the obvious hub. Geography determines history, determines which places become centres, which become peripheries, which become forgotten, and which become paradise. Bahrain's position made it inevitable that trade would flow through it, that connections would form, that wealth would accumulate, that the island would matter beyond its size, would punch above its weight, would become necessary to the Bronze Age world system. Perhaps there's something else too, something harder to measure, harder to verify. The climate is relatively mild compared to the Arabian interior. The Gulf moderates temperature. The summers are hot, unbearably hot sometimes, but the winters are gentle, comfortable, pleasant even. The dates grow abundantly. The fish are plentiful. The pearls in the surrounding waters are precious, rare, valuable. The island isn't just survivable, is genuinely pleasant, is a place where life can be good, where prosperity is possible, where the combination of resources and climate and position creates conditions for flourishing, for the kind of life that might feel like paradise, that might justify the mythological descriptions, that might make residents believe they live in blessed place, in land chosen by gods, in location where ordinary rules don't quite apply, where the impossible happens, where paradise isn't just distant memory but present reality. Take a breath. Feel that blessing. The visibility is significant too. Bahrain is visible from the Arabian coast, is visible from shipping lanes, rises from the water distinctly, can be seen from distance, can be navigated to, can be found. This matters for navigation, for ancient sailors without instruments, without GPS, with only landmarks and stars, and the accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. The island that can be seen can be reached, can be incorporated into mental maps, can become destination, can become known, can become the place everyone knows about, everyone mentions, everyone incorporates into their geographic understanding. The visibility makes Bahrain real in ways that hidden places can't be, makes it mappable, makes it part of the known world rather than the imagined world. And perhaps that's crucial. Perhaps paradise needed to be visible, needed to be reachable, needed to be the place you could theoretically sail to, even if you never did. Needed to be real enough to ground the mythology, to make the sacred geography plausible, to make belief possible. The pearl diving tradition is ancient, predates the Bronze Age perhaps, continues to present day. The Persian Gulf produces exceptional pearls, has produced them for millennia. The waters around Bahrain are particularly rich. The pearls are precious, are luxury items, are desired across the ancient world. The diving is difficult, dangerous, requires skill and courage, requires diving deep on single breath, holding that breath while searching, while harvesting, while defying the natural human fear of drowning. The pearls that emerge are beautiful, are lustrous, are evidence of hidden treasure, of wealth beneath the surface, of the Gulf giving up its secrets to those brave enough to descend. Perhaps this too contributed to the mythology, to the sense that Dilmun was special, was place where precious things came from depths, where what's hidden becomes revealed, where the underwater world yields treasures, where the impossible diving deep, breathing underwater metaphorically, brings reward, brings wealth, brings beauty, brings proof that risk is worth taking. That depth contains riches. That paradise might be not just on surface, but beneath, waiting, hidden, accessible only to those willing to descend. The environmental reality creates the mythological possibility. The geography doesn't determine the mythology, but it makes it plausible, makes it sustainable, makes it possible for people to believe that paradise exists here because, look, fresh water rises from salt. Look, the dates grow abundantly. Look, the pearls shine with inner light. Look, the island is visible and reachable and prosperous. Look, everything works. Everything confirms that this place is blessed, is special, is different from other places, is worthy of the name, worthy of the reputation, worthy of being called Dilmun, worthy of being identified with paradise. The hidden dimension isn't supernatural, is natural, is the remarkable geology and geography and climate that combine to create place that feels like miracle, that feels like divine gift, that feels like proof that the cosmos is generous, that blessings are real, that paradise, if not possible everywhere, is at least possible here, on this island, in these waters, where the sweet springs flow and the dates grow and the merchants prosper and the dead rest in tens of thousands of graves, where the hidden becomes visible, where the sacred is grounded in the real, where paradise is both mythology and geography, both impossible and undeniable, both distant memory and present experience. The environment holds the secret, not in supernatural sense, but in the simple, profound fact that this place works, has everything needed, makes life possible and pleasant both. And perhaps that's paradise, not deathlessness, not the absence of suffering, but the presence of abundance, of water and food and wealth and community, of the conditions that make flourishing possible, that make humans grateful, that make belief in blessing natural, that make paradise not just story but experience, not just memory but present reality, not just what was but what is, here, now, in this place, on this island, in Dilmun. Hidden in the iconography, carved into the circular seals that travelled across the Bronze Age world, lies visual language, symbolic vocabulary, images that meant something to those who created them and something else, something we're still trying to understand, to those who encounter them today. The seals are small, are portable, are objects that fit in palm, but the meanings they carry are vast, are complex, are the concentrated expression of culture, of belief, of identity, of the visual grammar through which Dilmun understood itself and presented itself to the world. The ships appear constantly, on seal after seal, the distinctive Gulf vessels, high prow, high stern, the design that would persist for millennia. The ships are not decorative, are not random, are central to Dilmun's identity, are what made the island matter, what connected it to the world, what carried the trade, what brought the prosperity. The ships are Dilmun's technology, are its power, are its means of transcending the limitation of island size, of reaching beyond, of participating in networks larger than itself. The ships carved into seals say, "We are mariners, we are travellers, we are connected, we matter because we move, because we sail, because we bridge distances others can't." The ship is identity, is pride, is the symbol that defines what Dilmun is. The palm trees are equally significant, appear on many seals, stand alone or in groves. The palms are practical reality. Dilmun exports dates, but are more than economic symbol, are life symbols, are proof of water, of habitability, of the blessing that makes existence possible. In arid region, in Gulf, where heat dominates, the palm is miracle, is proof that life persists, that growth happens, that fertility is real. The palm needs water, needs the springs, needs what shouldn't exist but does. So the palm tree on seal isn't just saying, "We grow dates," is saying, "We have water, we have life, we have the essential thing, we are blessed." The palm becomes theological statement, becomes proof of paradise, becomes visual evidence that this place is special, is touched by divine, is where natural impossibility becomes living reality. The animals are fascinating. Lions and gazelles appear frequently, bulls sometimes, snakes occasionally. The animals are both real and symbolic. Lions didn't live on Bahrain. too small, no native lion population, but lions lived in Mesopotamia, were known, were powerful, were royal symbols, were associated with kingship and divine power. The lion on Dilmun seal says, "What? Perhaps we understand your symbols. We participate in your visual language. We are cosmopolitan. We know what matters in the wider world." Or perhaps the lions are mythological, are not trying to represent actual Bahrain fauna, but are invoking divine power, are borrowing imagery from the sacred narratives that everyone shares, are participating in the iconographic vocabulary that transcends local differences. The gazelles are gentler, more plausible, could have lived on Bahrain or nearby, are associated with beauty, with swiftness, with the wild that's not threatening, that's not predator but prey, that exists in delicate balance. The gazelle paired with lion creates narrative, perhaps, creates the predator-prey relationship, or creates the peaceable kingdom imagery. The lion and gazelle together, not fighting, perhaps coexisting, perhaps echoing the paradise descriptions where the lion kills not, the wolf snatches not the lamb. Perhaps the seals are illustrating that theology, are making visual the mythological claim, are showing paradise where violence is absent, where natural enmity is suspended, where predator and prey exist in harmony that never exists in normal world. The imagery suggests Dilmun isn't just place, is different kind of place, is place where normal rules don't apply, where paradise is possible. Take a breath. Rest with those symbols. The Master of Animals motif appears occasionally. Human or divine figure, hard to distinguish, controlling beasts, holding them, standing between them. The iconography has ancient roots, appears in Mesopotamian art, in Indus art, in the shared visual vocabulary of Bronze Age Near East. The figure represents control, represents dominion, represents the civilization's power over nature, over the wild, over the forces that threaten. The Master of Animals says, "We are not at nature's mercy. We control, we organize, we impose order on chaos." Or perhaps, in sacred context, the figure is divine, is God controlling creation, is Enki perhaps, who brought the water, who made Dilmun habitable, who organized the chaos into paradise. The Master of Animals is authority, is power, is the force that makes civilization possible, that transforms wilderness into garden, that creates the conditions for human flourishing. The geometric patterns are harder to interpret. Hatching, cross-hatching, radiating lines, circles, the patterns might be decorative, might be filling space, or might mean something, might represent water. The lines as waves, as flow, might represent sky. The hatching as stars, as cosmic order, might represent divine presence. The geometric perfection as proof of supernatural design, or might just be aesthetics, might be the seal carver's art, the visual pleasure of pattern, of symmetry, of the careful arrangement that makes small object beautiful, worth possessing, worth pressing into clay, worth preserving. The ambiguity is permanent. We can speculate, can propose interpretations, but can't verify. The seal carvers left no explanations, no captions, no text saying this means that, just the images, silent, patient, waiting for us to understand or misunderstand or project our own meanings onto their forms. Perhaps the most intriguing seals show mythological creatures, composite animals, lion birds, bullmen, beings that don't exist, that never existed, that are pure imagination, pure symbolic creation. These are not representations of reality, are not attempts to depict what was seen, are attempts to express what was believed, what was imagined, what existed in the realm of meaning rather than the realm of matter. The mythological creatures say, "We believe in more than the visible, we acknowledge the unseen, we participate in stories that transcend ordinary experience, we are connected to the divine narratives, to the myths, to the sacred geography that includes beings and places and events that never happened materially but are real in ways that matter more than material reality. The composite animals are theology, are the visible form of invisible truths, are the attempt to make transcendence tangible, to give form to formlessness, to show what can't be shown but must be acknowledged. The seals were pressed into clay, made impressions. The impressions sealed documents, sealed goods, sealed jars, sealed tablets. The impression was authentication, was signature, was proof of identity, was saying, This is mine. This comes from me. This is authorized. This is legitimate. The seal was personal, was possession, was inheritance, was the object that defined you in commercial world, that gave you standing, that made your word binding. The images on the seal, whatever they meant theologically, also meant practically, this is who I am. This is my house, my lineage, my identity, my participation in the commercial networks, my right to trade, my mark, my presence in the world. The seal connected practical and sacred, connected identity and imagery, connected the person pressing it into clay with the symbols carved into stone, with the ships and palms and animals and geometries that said something, meant something, communicated something, even if we're not entirely sure what, even if the meanings are partly lost, partly hidden, partly waiting in the silence of the stone, in the patience of the imagery, in the symbols that outlasted the civilization, that survived when the city fell, that remain when the language is forgotten. The seals speak, but speak in visual language, in symbols, in the hidden vocabulary of image and meaning, and we listen, try to understand, try to hear what they're saying across the millennia, across the gulf of understanding that separates our world from theirs. The symbols remain, the meanings wait, and perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps mystery is the point. Perhaps the seals preserve not answers but questions, not certainty but possibility, not explanation but invitation to wonder, to imagine, to try to see as they saw, to believe as they believed, to understand that images mean more than they depict, that symbols carry weight beyond their representation, that the small circular seals are not just markers of trade but markers of identity, of belief, of the attempt to express in visible form the invisible truths that made Dilmun Dilmun. That made it paradise. That made it matter. Beneath the surface of the Persian Gulf, hidden under meters of water and millennia of sediment, lies the lost world, the landscape that existed before the seas rose, before the ice melted, before the shorelines moved inland and the river valleys flooded and the highlands became islands. The underwater archaeology is difficult, is expensive, is limited by visibility and preservation and the simple challenge of working beneath water. But what's been found is suggestive, is tantalizing, is evidence that human presence in the Gulf predates Dilmun, predates Bronze Age civilization, predates the cities and trade networks and the identifiable culture, goes back to when the geography was different, when the Gulf was smaller, when paradise, if paradise existed, might have been elsewhere, might have been in the places now drowned, now lost, now accessible only to divers and remote sensing and the slow, patient work of underwater excavation. The submerged sites are scattered, are found off the coasts of Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, are at various depths depending on when they were occupied, how long ago the water claimed them. The earliest might be 15,000 years old, might date to the end of the Ice Age, might be evidence of the people who lived in the Gulf when it was river valley, when the lowlands were habitable, when the coast was tens of kilometers from its current position. These are the lost settlements, the drowned villages, the sites that might preserve the earliest human response to the landscape that would become Dilmun. The archaeology is fragmentary, is difficult to interpret, but suggests continuous occupation, suggests that as the waters rose, people adapted, moved inland, followed the shifting coastline, maintained presence in region even as geography transformed around them. Perhaps this is where the flood myths originate, not in single catastrophic event, but in the gradual relentless rising of seas over millennia, over hundreds of generations, each generation seeing the water slightly higher, seeing the old villages abandoned, seeing the graves left behind, seeing the landscape of childhood become the underwater world of adulthood. The loss was real, was traumatic, was the kind of experience that creates stories, that preserves memory, that generates myths about the time before, when the world was different, when paradise existed, when the ancestors lived in places we can no longer reach, can no longer inhabit, can only remember, can only mythologize, can only preserve in narratives about golden age, about primordial world, about the time when gods walked among humans and the land was pure and death was absent. The flood myths might be cultural memory, might be the preservation across thousands of years of the actual experience of rising seas, of paradise lost to water, of the drowning of the world. The problem is verification, is proving that the myths describe the floods, that the stories preserve geological reality. The correlation is suggestive. The timing works. The post-glacial flooding occurred between 15,000 and 6,000 years ago, the period when human cultures were developing, were becoming complex, were creating the oral traditions that would eventually be written down. The flood narratives are universal, appear in Mesopotamia, in the Bible, in Greek mythology, in cultures worldwide. Perhaps the universality isn't because of single global flood, but because coastal peoples everywhere experienced the same thing, experienced the seas rising, the land disappearing, the homes being claimed by water. The experience was global because the melting was global, the rising seas were global, the loss was shared, and so the stories are similar. Our variations on same theme, our humanity processing the same trauma, the same transformation, the same permanent alteration of geography that changed everything, that made the old world inaccessible, that forced adaptation, that created the distinction between the time before and the time after, between paradise and the fallen world, between the golden age and the age of struggle. Take a breath. Let that loss settle. The underwater sites off Bahrain are particularly interesting, are dated to various periods. Some are relatively recent, only 2,000 to 3,000 years old, when sea levels were similar to today. These might be harbour structures, might be fishing villages, might be the infrastructure of Bronze Age Dilmun extending into the water, but others are older, are deeper, are 4 to 5 metres below current sea level, dating to perhaps 6,000 years ago, to the period when the Gulf was still filling, when the coastline was still shifting, when Bahrain was just becoming an island. These older sites might be Proto-Dilmun, might be the settlements that existed before the Bronze Age civilization, might be the origins, the foundation, the place where the story began before it was written down, before it became the Dilmun of cuneiform tablets and trade networks. What remains undiscovered is vast. The underwater survey of the Gulf has been limited, has covered only a small percentage of the area. Most of the ancient landscape remains unmapped, unexcavated, unknown. The technology is improving. Sonar, submersibles, remote sensing. Each advance reveals more, shows more sites, more potential, more possibility. But the work is slow, is expensive, requires specialized equipment and expertise, requires permission and funding, and the coordination of international teams. The pace of discovery is measured in years, in decades. Most of what's underwater will remain underwater for our lifetimes, will wait for future archaeologists, future technology, future understanding. Perhaps the most profound question is, what if the mythological Dilmun is underwater? What if the paradise of the texts isn't Bronze Age Bahrain, but earlier settlement, earlier landscape, the Dilmun that existed before the seas rose, the place that was lost to flooding, that survived in memory as paradise, as the time before, as the Golden Age? This would explain the contradiction, would explain why texts describe both trading port and deathless garden. The trading port is Bronze Age Bahrain, real, excavated, documented, but the deathless garden is memory, is the lost place, is the world that drowned, is the paradise that was real but is now inaccessible, now mythological, now preserved only in stories that don't quite match any existing location because the location no longer exists above water. The theory is speculative, is unprovable currently, but is compelling, fits the evidence, explains the ambiguity, explains why paradise feels both real and imaginary, both historical and mythological, both findable and forever lost. The silence beneath the water is complete, is absolute. The drowned sites don't speak, don't explain themselves, don't verify or refute the theories. Just wait. Preserve what they preserve. Hold what they hold. The sediment covers them, protects them perhaps, or obscures them. The Gulf waters are warm, are relatively shallow, are accessible in ways that deep ocean isn't, but are still barrier, still challenge, still the medium that separates us from the past. That keeps the secrets. That makes discovery difficult. That ensures most mysteries remain mysteries. The waters remember. but don't reveal, don't share easily, don't give up their knowledge without patient effort, without technology, without the dedication that drives underwater archaeology, without the commitment to understanding what's hidden, what's lost, what waits beneath the surface for someone willing to descend, to search, to bring to light what the darkness holds. The paradise might be down there, might be waiting, might be the actual location, the real place, the geography that became mythology, the landscape that memory preserved but geography transformed, that rising seas claimed but human consciousness refused to surrender. That became Dilmun, became the bright land, became the pure place, became paradise, not because it was supernatural, but because it was real, was good, was home, was the place that was lost. And loss creates paradise, creates the golden age, creates the mythology of the time before everything changed, before the waters came, before paradise drowned and became memory, became story, became the question we're still asking, still exploring, still diving for, still hoping to find, even though we know that finding it won't answer everything, won't explain everything, won't make paradise real again. Just make it visible, make it tangible, make it something we can point to and say, there, that's where it was, that's what was lost. That's why they remembered. That's why they called it paradise, because it was. And then it wasn't, and the not being made it sacred, made it mythological, made it Dilmun. The question that echoes through every translation, every excavation, every careful correlation between text and artifact is this: was Dilmun paradise, or did paradise just happen to be named Dilmun? Some scholars believe the answer is clear, straightforward, perhaps even obvious. The mythological Dilmun and the historical Dilmun are different entities, different concepts, different places entirely. They share a name, yes, but names can migrate, can shift, can be applied to multiple reference. The paradise of the myths is theological construct, is literary creation, is the Sumerian version of what every culture creates. The golden age, the time before, the place where suffering doesn't exist. And the historical Dilmun, the Bronze Age trading port, is real civilization with real economy and real artifacts. The two aren't connected except by unfortunate coincidence, by the reuse of a name, by the human tendency to assign sacred significance to familiar places. This interpretation has weight, has parsimony, has the advantage of not requiring extraordinary explanations. Every culture creates paradise myths. Greeks had the Golden Age, had Elysium, had the Islands of the Blessed. Romans had Saturnalia, the time when Saturn ruled and all was perfect. Hindus have Satya Yuga, the age of truth when righteousness prevailed. Chinese have various golden ages in legendary history. Christians have Eden, Muslims have Jannah. The pattern is universal, is human, is the psychological need to imagine that once, somewhere, life was better, was perfect, was free from the suffering that defines actual human experience. The Sumerians weren't different, had same needs, created same myths, imagined same perfect place, called it Dilmun. The name happened to match a real location, a trading partner, but that's coincidence. Or perhaps the mythological name came first and was later applied to real island. Or perhaps real island inspired the myth, but the mythological elaborations, the deathlessness, the absence of suffering, those are pure invention, pure wish fulfillment, pure theology. The contradictions support this view. How can a place be both commercial hub and deathless paradise? How can it have copper workshops and eternal life? How can it be real trading destination where merchants actually went and also be land of the living where gods placed immortals? The two descriptions don't match, don't fit together, don't describe the same kind of place. The commercial texts describe ordinary Bronze Age economy, goods traded, prices negotiated, ships arriving and departing, nothing supernatural, nothing that requires special explanation, just trade, just the normal functioning of Bronze Age commercial networks. The religious texts describe impossibility, describe world where natural laws don't operate, where predators don't hunt, where people don't age, where sickness doesn't exist. These aren't describing same reality, are describing different things, must be separated, must be understood as distinct. Perhaps the name confusion arose from geographical vagueness. Ancient geography was imprecise, was often symbolic, was organized more by conceptual categories than by accurate spatial relationships. Dilmun meant east, meant towards sunrise, meant distant land across water. Multiple places could be Dilmun, could fit the description. The commercial Dilmun was Bahrain, but mythological Dilmun was perhaps elsewhere, was perhaps no place. Was utopia in literal sense, utopos, no place? Was the location that exists only in imagination, only in theological need, only in the stories we tell about how things should be rather than how things are? The conflation happened later, happened when scribes and compilers tried to organize disparate traditions, tried to make coherent system from contradictory sources, tried to map mythology onto geography when mythology was never meant to be mapped, was never meant to be literal, was always metaphorical, symbolic, theological. The archaeological evidence supports skepticism. Bahrain shows normal Bronze Age civilization, shows urban development, shows trade, shows craft production, shows everything you'd expect from prosperous commercial center, but shows nothing supernatural, nothing that requires divine intervention to explain, nothing that suggests paradise. The copper workshops are intelligible without gods. The seals are beautiful but ordinary. The temples are impressive but architecturally explicable. The burial mounds are numerous but not unique. Other cultures created massive necropolises. The freshwater springs are geological, are the result of aquifer and favourable rock formations, not miracles. Everything found in Bahrain can be explained naturally, can be understood through normal archaeological interpretation, through economic and social analysis, through the standard tools of Bronze Age studies. Nothing requires mythological explanation. Nothing proves the myths are historical. Nothing bridges the gap between what texts claim and what artifacts show. Take a breath. Rest with that skepticism. Some scholars point to literary analysis, point to the structure and language of the myths. The Enki and Ninhursag text is sophisticated literature, is carefully constructed poetry, uses metaphor and symbolism and theological imagery, isn't attempting historical description, isn't claiming to document actual events, is expressing religious ideas through narrative, through story, through the language of myth, which operates differently than the language of chronicle, which has different purposes, different truth claims. Reading it as history is category error, is misunderstanding the genre, is treating poetry as prose, is expecting mythology to function as archaeology when mythology never aspired to that, never claimed that, was always doing something else, something more important perhaps than recording facts, was expressing meaning, was organizing cosmos theologically, was explaining in narrative form how the world works spiritually, even if not historically. The paradise descriptions might be aspirational, might be describing ideal rather than actual, might be saying, this is how things should be, this is how the gods intended, this is what we've lost, this is what we hope to regain. The absence of death and suffering isn't historical claim about past, is theological claim about divine will, about ultimate purpose, about the world as God's designed it before something went wrong, before the fall, before the corruption, before paradise became impossible. The myths preserve hope, preserve vision, preserve the belief that suffering isn't final, isn't ultimate, that restoration is possible, that paradise, though lost, though inaccessible now, is real somehow, is what we're moving toward, what we're striving for, what we'll achieve after death or after judgment or after cosmic renewal. The myths aren't about geography, are about eschatology, about salvation, about the religious answer to the problem of suffering. That answer is, this isn't how it's supposed to be. Once it was different, someday it will be different again. And that hope, that vision, that promise, that's what the myths preserve. That's what makes them sacred. That's what makes them matter, regardless of historical accuracy. Perhaps the strongest argument is comparative. Similar paradise myths exist globally. The patterns repeat: the golden age, the perfect beginning, the fall, the expulsion, the loss of immortality, the introduction of suffering. These are universal themes, appear independently in cultures with no contact. The universality suggests they're not historical memory, not specific events remembered, but psychological patterns, archetypal structures, the human mind organizing experience in similar ways, creating similar narratives, expressing similar needs. The myths are true, but psychologically true, spiritually true, not historically true, not geographically true. Dilmun as paradise is Sumerian expression of universal pattern, is their version of story everyone tells, isn't special, isn't unique, doesn't require special explanation, doesn't need to correspond to actual place, can be understood completely within literary and religious frameworks without invoking history, without claiming memory, without suggesting that paradise was real location rather than powerful idea. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps myths don't need to be historical to be valuable, to be meaningful, to be true in ways that matter more than factual accuracy. Perhaps Dilmun teaches us this, teaches us that the boundary between history and mythology isn't as important as we think, that what matters isn't whether paradise existed, but that people believed it did, that the belief shaped how they understood their world, their existence, their relationship with divine, that the myth was real in its effects, even if not real in its claims, that Dilmun, mythological Dilmun, is true because it expressed something essential about human longing, about divine promises, about the hope that drives us even when evidence suggests hope is irrational, that faith exists even when history doesn't confirm it. That paradise, though lost, though unreachable, though perhaps never existing, is still real, still true, still the place we come from and the place we're going to, still the name we give to the world as it should be, as the gods intended, as we'll find it when suffering ends and restoration comes and paradise returns, not as place on map, but as condition of existence, as state of being, as what Dilmun always was, what it always will be, what history can neither prove nor disprove because it operates in different register, different dimension, different kind of reality. The question remains for others. What if the skeptics are wrong? What if paradise isn't pure invention? What if the myths preserve something, some kernel of historical memory, some echo of actual events, some residue of real places that were lost and remembered and transformed into mythology? Some researchers believe this interpretation better fits the evidence, better explains the specificity, better accounts for the details that feel too precise to be pure invention. The myths don't describe generic paradise, describe specific place, with specific features, with verifiable geography, with fresh water springs and date palms and eastern location and all the characteristics that actually define Bahrain. The correspondence is too exact to dismiss, too consistent to attribute to coincidence. Perhaps the myths aren't documenting present paradise, but are preserving memory of past paradise, of place that existed before catastrophe, before flooding, before the transformation that made paradise inaccessible, that made it memory rather than reality, that made it myth rather than geography. The flood context is crucial. The Gilgamesh epic places Dilmun after the flood. Utnapishtim is granted immortality and placed in Dilmun after surviving the deluge that destroys humanity. The connection is explicit, is narrative structure of the text. Paradise exists in relation to flood, is what comes after, is where the survivor goes, is the reward for endurance, is the place that escapes destruction, or perhaps is the place whose destruction creates the myth. Perhaps the flood that destroys the world is the rising seas, is the post-glacial flooding that drowned the Persian Gulf's ancient landscape, that claimed the river valleys and coastal plains where early peoples lived. That created loss, created trauma, created the experience of watching homeland disappear beneath water, of being expelled from paradise not by divine decree, but by geological process. The correlation is compelling, the timing works. The flood myths are dated loosely into deep antiquity, to the time when oral traditions were forming, when the foundations of later written texts were being established, the same period when seas were rising, when coastlines were shifting, when the landscape was transforming. Perhaps the paradise that Sumerians remembered was real place. Was the Gulf when it was river valley? Was the coastal plains that are now underwater? Was the specific location, we may never know exactly where, that had all the characteristics the myths describe? Fresh water, abundant food, mild climate, the conditions that make life easy, that make survival not struggle, but joy, that create the experience of paradise, of place where everything works, where nature provides, where suffering is minimal, where life is good, and that place was lost, was drowned, was claimed by rising waters over centuries, but traumatically enough to create lasting memory, to create stories, to create the mythology of expulsion, of loss, of the time before when things were better, when paradise existed, when we lived in blessed land. The mythology preserves geography, preserves the actual experience of losing homeland to water, but transforms it, theologizes it, makes it about gods and punishment and cosmic drama rather than about geology and climate and the impersonal forces that don't care about human suffering. The transformation is natural, is how humans process trauma, how we make meaning from loss, how we turn history into myth and myth into theology. The specificity matters. The myths mention ravens and lions and lambs, mention specific animals, specific relationships, specific absences. Why these details if pure invention? Why not just say, paradise was perfect? Why elaborate? Why create specific imagery about predators not hunting, about birds not crying, about people not aging? Perhaps because the details preserve memory, preserve the experience of specific place at specific time. The animals mentioned might have lived in the ancient Gulf landscape, the ecosystem that existed when climate was different, when moisture patterns supported different flora and fauna, the predators and prey that shared the river valleys, the birds that lived along the ancient coasts. The memory is garbled, is transformed, is overlaid with theological meaning, but underneath, perhaps, is observation, is the experience of people who lived in that landscape, who knew those animals, who processed their loss through stories about world where violence ended, where natural enmity ceased, where paradise meant not just abundance, but peace, harmony, the suspension of the predation that dominates normal world. Perhaps the most compelling argument is cultural memory. Other examples exist, other cases where mythology preserves geological events. The Black Sea flood is documented, is verified. Around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus, flooded the Black Sea basin, raised water level dramatically, created catastrophe for peoples living on the shores, and the memory persisted. Some scholars connect this to flood myths in the region, to the stories that Noah myths might derive from. The correlation isn't perfect, isn't proven, but is suggestive, shows that catastrophic floods do create lasting cultural memory, do generate myths that persist for millennia, do transform into religious narratives. If Black Sea flooding can create Noah myth, why can't Persian Gulf flooding create Dilmun myth? The mechanism is the same. The process is identical. The human response, creating stories, preserving memory in mythological form, that's universal. That's what we do with trauma, with loss, with the experiences too profound to forget but too distant to remember accurately. Take a breath, open to this possibility. Some researchers point to the burial patterns, the tens of thousands of graves in Bahrain, the evidence that people from distant places were buried here. Perhaps they were buried in paradise. Perhaps Bahrain inherited the reputation, the sacred status, the belief that burial here conferred special afterlife status. Perhaps because earlier Dilmun, the paradise that drowned, couldn't be reached anymore for burial, so the name transferred, the sacredness transferred, to the island that was visible, that was accessible, that had similar features, had the fresh water, had the eastern position, had enough similarity to the lost paradise that it could become the new Dilmun, the practical Dilmun, the Bronze Age Dilmun, but carrying the reputation, carrying the name, carrying the association with paradise that made burial here desirable. That made it the place you wanted your bones to rest, the place where eternal life might be possible, where paradise might still be reachable, where the memory of the lost place might be honoured, might be preserved, might be kept alive through the act of burial, through bringing the dead to the new Dilmun, because the old Dilmun, the real paradise, is now beneath the waters, is now accessible only through death, through the journey that takes souls beyond the living world, beyond the geographical world, into the mythological world where drowned places still exist, where paradise is still reachable, where memory preserves what history lost. We may never know for certain. The evidence is ambiguous. The underwater sites are mostly unexplored. The ancient texts are fragmentary. The memories, if they are memories, are transformed beyond verification. But perhaps the question itself is valuable. Perhaps asking whether Dilmun preserves memory opens us to possibility, to the recognition that mythology and history aren't separate, that they interpenetrate, that ancient peoples didn't distinguish as sharply as we do, that their sacred narratives might contain historical kernels even while expressing theological truths, that both can be true simultaneously, that Dilmun can be myth and memory both, can be invention and preservation, can be pure theology and garbled history, can be all of these and none of these and something we don't have categories for. Perhaps the deepest truth is that paradise is always lost, is always in the past, is always the place we can't return to, whether that place was real location or psychological state or theological vision. Perhaps doesn't matter as much as the fact that the longing is real, the loss is real, the memory, whether historical or invented, is real in its effects, is real in how it shapes us, how it makes us yearn, how it makes us believe that once things were better, that somewhere paradise exists or existed or will exist, that the suffering that defines current existence isn't final, isn't ultimate, isn't all there is. The myths preserve that hope, that belief, that vision. Whether they preserve actual geography, that's secondary. What they preserve primarily is human refusal to accept that this world, this fallen world, this world of suffering and death and violence, is all there is. The refusal to believe that paradise is impossible. The insistence that somewhere, sometime paradise was or will be real. And Dilmun is the name the Sumerians gave that hope, that vision, that memory or invention or longing that won't die, that persists, that transforms real island into sacred space, that makes Bronze Age trading port into echo of paradise, that preserves in mythology what history may have lost, what the waters may have claimed, what the rising seas may have drowned, the paradise that was, the paradise that will be, the paradise that exists always in the gap between memory and hope, between past and future, between the world as it was and the world as it should be. And perhaps that's where Dilmun lives, not on any map, not in any archaeological site, but in that gap, in that space, in the human heart that refuses to forget paradise even when paradise has vanished, even when all evidence suggests it never existed, even when skepticism seems more reasonable than faith. The memory persists, the myth endures, and Dilmun, whether real or imagined, whether history or hope, continues to be what it always was: paradise, lost and remembered, gone and present, impossible and true, the place we came from and the place we long for, the name we give to the world when it's right, when it's whole, when it's what the gods intended before everything went wrong, before the waters rose, before we were expelled, before paradise became myth, before myth became the only way to preserve what was or might have been or should have been. The question endures, and perhaps the endurance is the answer. Perhaps the fact that we're still asking, still wondering, still hoping that paradise might be real. That's the proof, not of historical Dilmun, but of human Dilmun, of the paradise we carry within, the paradise we project backward and forward, the paradise that exists in memory and hope if nowhere else. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's what the myths were always saying, that paradise is real because we make it real, through remembering, through hoping, through refusing to forget. The civilization declined, as all civilizations do, not suddenly, not catastrophically, but gradually. The trade routes shifted, the demand for copper changed as new sources were developed. The Mesopotamian powers that had been Dilmun's primary partners collapsed or transformed. The Kassites conquered Babylon. The political landscape reorganized, and in that reorganization, Dilmun's centrality diminished. The island remained inhabited, remained prosperous for centuries after the peak. But the Golden Age was ending. The period when Dilmun was essential, when it was the hub, when it was paradise both commercial and mythological, that was passing. Slowly, patiently, inevitably, the way all golden ages pass. the way all paradises are lost, not through expulsion, but through transformation, through the subtle changes that accumulate over generations until the world is different, until what was is no longer, until memory is all that remains. The name persisted longer than the civilization. Dilmun continued to be mentioned in texts, in inscriptions, in the records of later empires. The Assyrians knew of Dilmun, the Persians. The Greeks called the island Tylos, a different name, but the same place. The continuity was maintained even as the identity shifted, even as the Bronze Age trading culture gave way to other peoples, other languages, other gods. The fresh water springs continued flowing, the dates continued growing, the island continued being inhabited, but the connection to the ancient paradise, to the mythological Dilmun that faded, was forgotten, became obscure, became the kind of knowledge that specialists might know, but that common understanding lost. The texts that mentioned Dilmun, the Sumerian myths, those were copied for centuries, were preserved in the scribal schools, were part of the educational curriculum that trained generations of scribes in Mesopotamia. But eventually, even that transmission ended. The cuneiform writing system was abandoned, the languages died, Sumerian ceased being spoken, Akkadian followed, and the texts that preserved Dilmun's name, those became unreadable, became mysterious marks on clay tablets, became artifacts rather than literature, became silent. For over 2,000 years, Dilmun was forgotten. The name disappeared from human knowledge. The tablets that mentioned it sat in ruins, buried, inaccessible. The myths that described paradise were lost, were waiting beneath Iraqi soil, beneath the tells that marked ancient cities. The connection between Bahrain and paradise was severed. The island continued existing, continued being inhabited, had its own history, its own cultures, its own names. But the Bronze Age identity, the Dilmun identity, that was gone, was lost, was hidden in the earth, in the silence that falls when civilizations end and their stories stop being told. The forgetting was complete, was so thorough that when Europeans began exploring the Gulf in the 16th and 17th centuries, when they mapped Bahrain, when they documented its features, they had no idea they were visiting paradise, no idea the island had once been sacred, had once been the bright land, the pure place, the location where gods dwelt and immortals rested. The knowledge was lost, the memory was erased, the story had ended. The recovery began in the 19th century, when archaeologists started excavating Mesopotamia, when they found the tells, opened the libraries, discovered thousands of clay tablets, and slowly, painstakingly, began to decipher them. The breakthrough was cuneiform, learning to read the wedge-shaped script that had been dead for 2 millennia. The process took decades, required brilliant scholars working across multiple languages, across multiple cultures, slowly piecing together the grammatical structures, the vocabularies, the meanings, and as the texts became readable, as the Sumerian and Akkadian languages came back to life, names emerged, place names, geographic references, and among them, Dilmun, mentioned in trade texts, in myths, in religious literature, in administrative documents. The name appeared again and again, was clearly important, was clearly significant. But where was it? What was it? The texts gave clues, but not coordinates, described it as east, as across the lower sea, as source of copper, as paradise, but didn't provide map, didn't give latitude and longitude, didn't say unambiguously, this is Dilmun, this island, this place. The identification came through correlation, through archaeology in Bahrain, revealing Bronze Age civilization, through the distinctive seals being found in both Bahrain and Mesopotamia, through the timeline matching, through the freshwater springs existing where myths said they should, through the eastern location fitting the descriptions, through the accumulation of evidence that pointed, not with absolute certainty, but with strong probability, toward Bahrain being Dilmun. The commercial Dilmun at least, the real trading partner, the Bronze Age port, whether it was also the mythological paradise that remained debated, remained uncertain, but the connection was established, the name returned, and with it, the possibility, the wonder, the question that could be asked again after 2 millennia of silence. Was this paradise? Was this where the myths pointed? Was this the lost bright land, take a breath, feel that recovery. Even now, the research continues. The excavations at Qalat al-Bahrain are ongoing. New areas are being explored, new artifacts emerging, new contexts being documented. The site is enormous. Most remains unexcavated, most waits beneath earth. Each season reveals more, adds to understanding, refines chronology, clarifies relationships, shows more about how Bronze Age Dilmun functioned, how it traded, how it lived, how it died. The work is slow, is methodical, is the patient accumulation of knowledge that archaeology requires. The same patience the ancient astronomers showed, the same dedication, the same commitment to understanding that spans lifetimes, that builds across generations, that creates knowledge slowly but permanently. Still today, new technologies reveal more. Ground-penetrating radar shows buried structures without excavation. Satellite imagery reveals patterns invisible from ground level. Chemical analysis identifies trade goods origins. DNA analysis examines the bones from burial mounds. Isotope studies trace diets and migrations. Each technique adds dimension, adds perspective, adds data that previous generations couldn't access. The picture becomes richer, more complex, more nuanced, more human. The Bronze Age inhabitants of Dilmun become less abstract, more real, more like us. People with diets we can analyze, with health conditions we can diagnose, with genetic relationships we can map, with individual stories preserved in their bones if we know how to read them. The underwater archaeology is beginning, is still in early stages, but shows promise, shows potential. The surveys reveal sites, the dives document structures, the samples provide dating material. Slowly, very slowly, the drowned landscape is being mapped, is being understood, is yielding its secrets to those willing to descend, to search beneath the waters, to explore what the post-glacial flooding claimed. What might be the earlier Dilmun, the proto-paradise, the lost world, that memory preserved in myths about the time before. The work is expensive, is technically challenging, requires international cooperation, but continues, persists, adds each season to the growing understanding of what lies beneath the gulf, what the waters claimed, what time and tide have hidden, what patience and technology might reveal. Still today, Bahrain remembers. The modern nation has claimed Dilmun as heritage, as identity, as the ancient glory that predates all later history. The archaeological sites are protected, are promoted, are part of national story. Qalat al-Bahrain is UNESCO World Heritage Site, is tourist destination, is source of pride. The connection to paradise, however uncertain, however debated, is embraced, is celebrated, is the claim that makes modern Bahrain heir to something ancient, something significant, something that matters beyond current politics or economics. The past legitimizes the present, connects contemporary inhabitants to Bronze Age traders, to the merchants and priests who made Dilmun matter 4,000 years ago. The continuity might be more claimed than real, might be more constructed than inherited, but is meaningful nonetheless. Creates identity, creates belonging, creates the sense that this place has always been special, has always been blessed, has always been paradise or close to it. Perhaps the most profound legacy is the question itself, the wondering about paradise, about whether myths preserve memory, about whether the lost golden age was real or invented, about whether we can find what was lost or whether loss is permanent. The question connects us. Connects modern archaeologists to ancient scribes, connects skeptics to believers, connects everyone who looks at the evidence, reads the texts, visits the sites, and wonders what it meant, what was true, what was hoped, what was remembered, and what was imagined. The question has no final answer, has no archaeological proof that closes the inquiry, has only the ongoing exploration, the continued wondering. The refusal to stop asking even when answers seem impossible. And perhaps that's the real legacy, not the knowledge of whether Dilmun was paradise, but the sustained questioning, the persistent curiosity, the human need to know where we came from, where paradise was, whether it existed, whether we can find it, whether return is possible or whether all we can do is remember, is preserve the stories, is keep asking, is maintain the connection to the ancestors who built on this island, who traded across the Gulf, who believed or hoped or wondered whether this place was special, was blessed, was paradise. The stars that watched Bronze Age Dilmun, that shone on the merchants and priests and craftsmen, those stars still shine, barely shifted, still marking the same patterns, still witnessing, still indifferent and eternal both. The sky hasn't changed. The cosmos hasn't noticed that Dilmun rose and flourished and declined, that paradise was named and lost and rediscovered, that humans built and buried and excavated, that memory failed and was restored, that questions were asked and remain unanswered. The stars just shine, just mark time, just continue the patient observation that outlasts everything human, everything temporal, everything that rises and falls and leaves only traces. The stars watched paradise. Watch still. We'll watch when our questions also become archaeological artifacts, when our wondering is forgotten, when new peoples dig through our ruins and wonder what we believed, what we hoped, what we called paradise. The pattern continues, the cycle repeats, and somewhere in that continuity, in that endless rising and falling and rising again, Dilmun persists, not as place necessarily, but as question, as possibility, as the name we give to the longing that doesn't die, that survives forgetting, that returns when memory returns, that matters because we make it matter, because we keep asking, because we refuse to accept that paradise is forever lost, forever unknowable, forever beyond recovery. The story continues in us, in you listening, in everyone who hears about Dilmun and wonders if paradise was real, wonders if we can find it, wonders if the question itself is the answer, if the searching is the finding, if the wondering is the way back to paradise, not as location but as consciousness, not as geography but as the state of mind that believes paradise is possible, was possible, will be possible, somewhere, somehow, in the bright land, in the pure place, in Dilmun, and so we return. Back to this moment, back to wherever you are now, listening to this, feeling whatever supports you, back to the present, which is all any of us can truly inhabit. The journey through ancient Dilmun is complete. The texts have been read, the sites have been explored, the theories have been considered, and here we are, still uncertain, still wondering, still holding the question without demanding it resolve. The Persian Gulf waters are warm tonight, as they've always been, as they were 4,000 years ago when Bronze Age merchants sailed across them carrying copper and dates, as they were 8,000 years ago when the shorelines were different and the islands were just emerging, as they were 15,000 years ago when much of the Gulf was river valley and paradise, if paradise existed, might have been dry land. The waters don't remember, don't preserve the memory of what they claimed, don't know that humans called the land they drowned paradise, don't know that loss created mythology, that geography became theology, that the flooding became expulsion. The waters just are, just flow, just continue the patient work of existing, of moving with tides and currents, of reflecting stars, of holding secrets without knowing they're secrets, without caring whether anyone discovers them. The freshwater springs in Bahrain still flow, still sweet, still cool, still rising from the underground aquifer that made habitation possible. That made the island special. That made it feel like miracle. The springs don't know they're in the myths, don't know that Enki, in the stories, made them flow, don't know that ancient peoples considered them divine gift, proof of blessing, evidence of paradise. The springs just flow, have flowed for thousands of years, will flow for thousands more perhaps, until geological shifts close the aquifer, until the sweet water stops rising, until the miracle, if it was miracle, ends. But that's distant future. Tonight the springs flow, tonight the water rises, tonight the gift continues whether anyone notices or not, whether anyone remembers the mythology or not, whether paradise is real or was ever real or will be real again. The burial mounds rest beneath the Bahrain sky, silent, patient, holding the bones of tens of thousands, holding the bronze and pottery and seals buried with them, holding whatever hopes the living had when they laid the dead in chambers and covered them with earth, holding the belief, perhaps, that burial in Dilmun mattered, that this island was special, that paradise was accessible through death if not through life, that eternal rest was possible here, that the bright land could be reached. The mounds don't speak, don't confirm or deny, don't reveal whether the hope was justified, don't tell us if the dead found what was promised, found peace, found paradise, found anything beyond the darkness and silence that graves hold. The mounds just are, just mark the landscape, just preserve what they preserve and keep what they keep and wait with the patience that only the dead possess. Take a breath, rest in that stillness. Perhaps the deepest truth is this: we don't know, can't know, won't know with certainty whether Dilmun was paradise, whether the myths describe real place, whether the flooding drowned actual golden age, whether memory preserves geography or invention creates theology. The evidence is ambiguous. The texts are fragmentary. The archaeology is impressive but incomplete. The underwater sites remain mostly unexplored. The questions outnumber the answers. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps mystery is the correct state. Perhaps some questions aren't meant to be resolved, aren't meant to have final answers, are meant to remain open, to invite wonder, to sustain inquiry, to keep us looking, searching, asking, connecting to the ancient peoples through shared wondering, through shared hope that paradise is more than invention, more than wish fulfillment, more than the story we tell because we can't accept that this world, this fallen, imperfect, suffering world, is all there is. Perhaps paradise is always lost, is always behind us or ahead of us, but never present, never here, never now. Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps paradise exists in the gap, in the distance, in the longing that creates mythology, in the loss that generates memory, in the hope that refuses to die even when evidence suggests it should. Dilmun teaches us this, perhaps, teaches us that the question of paradise is more important than the answer, that the searching matters more than the finding, that the stories preserve something essential even if they don't preserve facts, preserve the human refusal to accept that paradise is impossible, that the golden age is invention, that we're alone in cosmos that doesn't care. The myths say, once things were better, somewhere paradise exists or existed or will exist. The suffering isn't ultimate, the fall isn't final, return is possible. Restoration will come. And perhaps that's true, not historically, not geographically, but spiritually, psychologically, in the ways that matter most, in the refusal to despair, in the maintenance of hope, in the belief that paradise is real because we make it real through remembering and longing and refusing to forget. The stars turn slowly overhead, the same stars ancient astronomers watched from ziggurats, the same patterns, the same lights travelling across the same distances to reach eyes that look up with the same questions. Are we alone? Does the cosmos notice us? Does our wondering matter? The stars don't answer, never answered, continue their ancient patterns with indifference that might be wisdom, might be the peace that comes from not needing answers, from just being, just shining, just existing without the human burden of meaning-making, of storytelling, of trying to understand what cannot be understood. The stars just are, and in their being, in their patient, eternal being, there's comfort perhaps, there's constancy, there's the reminder that some things endure, that patterns persist, that the cosmos continues regardless of whether we find paradise or lose it, whether we remember or forget, whether our questions are answered or remain eternal. The wind moves across the ruins, across the tell at Qalat al-Bahrain, across the burial mounds, across the temple foundations, across the places where Bronze Age peoples lived and worked and worshipped and died believing, or hoping, or wondering, whether they lived in paradise. The wind carries nothing, knows nothing, just moves, just continues the patient work of erosion, of weathering, of slowly returning everything to earth, to dust, to the state before form, before meaning, before humans created civilizations and mythologies and the questions that outlast both. The wind is time made visible, is change, is the force that makes nothing permanent, that makes even paradise temporary, That makes memory necessary because what was won't last, won't endure, won't remain accessible except through the stories we tell, the myths we preserve, the wondering we maintain. And here, in the present, Dilmun waits. Not in any single location, not in Bahrain only, or in underwater sites only, or in the texts only, but in all of these, and none of these, in the question itself, in the wondering that connects us to Sumerians who wondered before us, who looked at their world and asked whether paradise was real, whether gods walked among them, whether the bright land existed, or was hope made geography, made mythology, made the story that gave meaning to suffering by promising it wasn't final, wasn't ultimate, that somewhere paradise, that once paradise, that eventually paradise. The story doesn't end, can't end, continues in everyone who hears the name Dilmun and asks what it was, where it was, whether it was, continues in the search, in the excavation, in the patient work of archaeology and translation and interpretation that brings ancient voices back to life. That makes the past present. That makes the dead speak. That makes paradise possible again, not as place to visit, but as question to hold, as wonder to maintain, as the human capacity for hope that survives all evidence against it. If you're ready to descend deeper into ancient worlds, subscribe. More temples, more ancient paradises, more tablets, more nights exploring what endures beneath everything we think is permanent. There's always more. The night deepens wherever you are. The Gulf waters flow, the springs rise, the stars shine, the wind moves, the stones remember what language forgot, and somewhere in that stillness, in that quiet space between memory and hope, between past and future, between what was and what might be, Dilmun continues, not as answer, but as question, not as place found, but as place sought, not as paradise proven, but as paradise imagined, remembered, hoped for, lost and longed for, real in its unreality, true in its mystery, present in its absence, the bright land, the pure place, the paradise.